Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. I want to tell you a story that, while tragic, serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of seeking justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Tonight, we explore the case of Sarah Good, a young mother whose life was cut short on what should have been a simple night out with friends. Sarah Elizabeth Good was 21 years old in the spring of 2014, a young woman navigating the complexities of single motherhood while building a career in the medical field. She worked as a medical technician, a job that required precision, compassion, and dedication, qualities that those who knew her said defined her character. Sarah lived in Medford, a middle-class community on Long Island where tree-lined streets and modest homes created the kind of neighborhood where people still knew their neighbors' names. It was the type of place where children could ride their bikes safely and where a young mother like Sarah could feel secure raising her 4-year-old daughter, Jocelyn. Jocelyn was the center of Sarah's universe. The little girl had Sarah's bright eyes and infectious smile, and friends often commented on how devoted Sarah was as a mother. Every decision Sarah made seemed to revolve around what was best for Jocelyn. She worked hard to provide for her daughter, often picking up extra shifts at the medical facility where she was employed. Sarah's family was close-knit. Her sister lived nearby, and they spoke almost daily. Her brother-in-law, Nick Janetto, was more than just family. He was a trusted friend who often helped with babysitting duties when Sarah needed to work late or, on rare occasions, when she wanted to spend time with friends. Those who knew Sarah described her as responsible, caring, and perhaps most importantly for a young single mother, fiercely protective of her daughter. She didn't go out often, preferring to spend her free time at home with Jocelyn. But even the most dedicated parents need a break sometimes, and that's exactly what Sarah was looking forward to on the evening of June 6, 2014. The spring had been particularly challenging for Sarah. She had recently ended a 2-year relationship with her boyfriend, a decision that had left her emotionally drained but ultimately hopeful about the future. Her friends had been encouraging her to get out more, to remember that she was still a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. When her friends invited her to a party in Medford that Friday evening, Sarah initially hesitated. She rarely left Jocelyn with a babysitter, and the thought of being away from her daughter for an entire evening made her anxious. But Nick had volunteered to watch Jocelyn, and Sarah's friends had been so supportive during her recent breakup that she felt she owed it to them, and to herself, to say yes. The party was nothing extraordinary, just a gathering of friends and acquaintances at someone's house, the kind of informal get-together that happens thousands of times across Long Island every weekend. There would be music, conversation, maybe some drinks, and most importantly for Sarah, a chance to forget about her responsibilities for just a few hours and simply be a young woman enjoying the company of her peers. As Sarah prepared for the evening, she could never have imagined that this simple decision to spend time with friends would set in motion a chain of events that would not only end her own life but devastate her family and community. She kissed Jocelyn goodbye, thanked Nick for babysitting, and headed out into the warm June evening, looking forward to what she hoped would be a relaxing night among friends. The house party on June 6 was typical of many summer gatherings in suburban Long Island. Young adults in their late teens and early 20s mingled in the backyard, music played from portable speakers, and conversations flowed as freely as the drinks. For Sarah, it was exactly what she needed, a chance to unwind and enjoy herself without the constant responsibilities of motherhood weighing on her mind. Sarah arrived in the early evening, grateful to see familiar faces among the crowd. She moved through the party with the ease of someone who was genuinely liked by her peers. Friends later recalled that she seemed relaxed and happy that night, more carefree than they had seen her in months following her recent breakup. It was at this party that Sarah encountered Dante Taylor. At 19 years old, Taylor was a former Marine from the nearby community of Mastic. He was younger than Sarah, but like many young men his age, he carried himself with a confidence that could be either charming or intimidating, depending on the circumstances. Taylor wasn't a complete stranger to Sarah's social circle, but they didn't know each other well. He was the type of person who appeared at parties without necessarily being close friends with the hosts, someone who moved on the periphery of various social groups without belonging fully to any one of them. Throughout the evening, cell phone records would later reveal, Sarah and Taylor exchanged numbers and began communicating via calls and text messages. To observers at the party, this might have seemed like typical social interaction, two young people meeting and finding some common ground for conversation. But beneath the surface of this seemingly innocent encounter, something darker was taking root in Taylor's mind. Friends of Sarah's would later tell investigators that while Sarah was friendly toward Taylor, she didn't appear to be romantically interested in him. She was, after all, newly single and focused on enjoying time with her established group of friends rather than pursuing any new romantic connections. As the evening progressed, the party began to wind down. People started making plans to leave, calling rides, or simply walking to their cars. Sarah, who had been careful not to drink too much, another indication of her responsible nature, prepared to head home to relieve Nick of his babysitting duties and check on Jocelyn. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah at the party was sometime after midnight on June 7. Security cameras and witness accounts would later help investigators piece together the basic timeline, but the crucial moments, those final interactions between Sarah and Taylor, remained shrouded in mystery. What investigators would eventually uncover through painstaking detective work was that Taylor had developed an obsession with Sarah during the course of the evening. Whether this fixation was romantic, sexual, or simply predatory in nature, it had grown to dangerous proportions by the time the party was ending. Sarah said her goodbyes to friends, gathered her belongings, and walked toward her car. It was a journey of perhaps 50 yards through a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of walk that should have been completely safe. She had her keys in her hand, her phone in her purse, and every intention of driving home to her daughter. She never made it. When Sarah didn't return home that night, Nick Janetto initially wasn't alarmed. He assumed she might have decided to spend the night at a friend's house or perhaps had gone to breakfast with the group after the party ended. Young adults often made spontaneous decisions, and Sarah, despite her responsibilities as a mother, was still entitled to some freedom. But as Saturday morning turned to afternoon, and then afternoon to evening, concern began to grow. Sarah was many things, but irresponsible was not one of them. She would never leave Jocelyn overnight without calling, and she certainly wouldn't disappear without explanation when someone was watching her daughter. By Sunday, June 8, the concern had transformed into genuine alarm. Sarah's sister tried calling her repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished from the face of the earth. When family members went to check Sarah's apartment, they found everything exactly as she had left it before the party. Her bed was still made, her work clothes laid out for Monday morning, and Jocelyn's toys scattered around the living room exactly where they had been when Sarah kissed her daughter goodbye 2 nights earlier. The decision to contact police was not made lightly. Everyone hoped there was a simple explanation. Perhaps Sarah had spontaneously decided to take a short trip, or maybe she was dealing with some personal crisis and needed space to think. But deep down, everyone who knew Sarah understood that something was terribly wrong. When Sarah's sister filed the missing person report on June 8, Suffolk County Police began their initial investigation with the routine questions that accompany such cases. Had Sarah been depressed? Was she involved in any disputes? Did she have any enemies? Had there been any recent changes in her behavior? The answers painted a picture of a stable, loving mother who had no reason to disappear voluntarily. Yes, she had recently ended a relationship, but friends and family insisted she was handling the breakup well and looking forward to moving on with her life. She had no financial troubles, no legal problems, and no indication of mental health issues that might explain a sudden departure. The first major break in the case came when investigators located Sarah's car. The vehicle was found on Fire Avenue in Medford, not far from her home but in a location that made no sense given her normal routines. The car was parked in a way that suggested it had been abandoned hastily, and when crime scene technicians processed it, they made a chilling discovery. On the hood of Sarah's car was a bloody handprint. The print was clear enough to be photographed and analyzed, and its location suggested that someone had leaned against or touched the vehicle while their hand was covered in blood. Even more disturbing was the discovery of additional blood evidence inside the vehicle, indicating that violence had occurred either in or very near the car. This evidence transformed the missing person case into a potential homicide investigation. The Suffolk County Police Department's homicide squad took over the case, and the search for Sarah Good intensified dramatically. The search for Sarah Good became a community effort that demonstrated the best of human nature in the face of tragedy. When word spread that a local mother had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, volunteers from across Long Island joined professional search teams in scouring the area. The terrain around Medford presented both opportunities and challenges for the search teams. The community was surrounded by patches of undeveloped land, small wooded areas, vacant lots, and the kind of overgrown spaces that exist in the margins of suburban development. These areas provided numerous places where someone might hide evidence, but they also created an enormous search area for the volunteers and police. Organized search parties spread out across the community each day, with volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through wooded areas, checking drainage ditches, and investigating any location where someone might conceivably hide a body. The searches were methodical and exhausting, conducted under the scorching June sun with the constant weight of knowing that time was not on their side. Sarah's family joined the searches whenever possible, though the emotional toll was visible on their faces. Her sister distributed flyers with Sarah's photograph, hoping that someone might have seen her after the party. Local media picked up the story, broadcasting Sarah's picture and asking anyone with information to contact police. The community response was overwhelming. Neighbors who had never met Sarah joined the search efforts. Local businesses donated water and supplies for the volunteers. Churches held prayer vigils. The case had touched something deep in the collective consciousness of Long Island, perhaps because Sarah represented every young mother in the community, every daughter, every sister who simply wanted to enjoy a night out with friends. Behind the scenes, detectives were pursuing leads with the focused intensity that major criminal investigations require. They interviewed everyone who had been at the party, creating a detailed timeline of the evening's events. They examined Sarah's phone records, her social media accounts, and her recent communications. They spoke with her ex-boyfriend, her co-workers, and anyone else who had been part of her life in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The bloody handprint on Sarah's car had been processed for DNA and fingerprint analysis, but results from the state crime lab would take time. In the meantime, investigators worked with the physical evidence they had, trying to understand what had happened in those crucial hours after Sarah left the party. On June 12, 6 days after Sarah had last been seen alive, the search effort yielded the discovery that everyone had been dreading yet somehow expecting. A volunteer searcher working in a wooded area near Camden Court in Medford came across what appeared to be human remains. The location was secluded, hidden among thick vegetation in an area that would have been nearly impossible to find without a systematic search. It was the kind of place someone might choose if they wanted to conceal evidence, far enough from residential areas to avoid detection but still within the general vicinity of where Sarah had last been seen. When police arrived at the scene and carefully processed the area, their worst fears were confirmed. The remains were those of Sarah Good. The young mother who had simply wanted to enjoy an evening with friends had been murdered and her body disposed of in this lonely patch of woods. The crime scene where Sarah's body was discovered told a story of unimaginable violence and cruelty. When the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office conducted the autopsy, the full extent of the brutality became clear, painting a picture of a crime that was as senseless as it was savage. Sarah had been stabbed more than 40 times. The wounds covered her body, indicating a frenzied attack that went far beyond what would have been necessary to cause her death. This type of overkill suggested a perpetrator who was either in an extreme emotional state or someone who derived satisfaction from inflicting pain and suffering. The autopsy also confirmed that Sarah had been sexually assaulted before her death. This discovery added another layer of horror to an already heinous crime and provided investigators with potential DNA evidence that could help identify her killer. The location where Sarah's body was found also yielded important clues. The killer had made some effort to conceal the remains, but not with the sophistication that might indicate an experienced criminal. Instead, the disposal of the body seemed hurried and panicked, as if the perpetrator had been primarily focused on getting away from the scene rather than carefully covering their tracks. Crime scene technicians spent hours methodically processing the wooded area, collecting potential evidence and documenting every detail that might prove relevant to the investigation. They photographed the scene from multiple angles, created detailed measurements and diagrams, and carefully preserved any physical evidence that might contain DNA or fingerprints. The condition of Sarah's clothing and personal effects provided additional insights into the crime. Her belongings were scattered, suggesting a struggle had taken place. Some items were missing entirely, possibly taken by the killer as trophies or simply lost during the violence of the attack. Back at the laboratory, forensic scientists began the painstaking process of analyzing the physical evidence collected from both the crime scene and Sarah's abandoned vehicle. The bloody handprint on her car hood was subjected to detailed analysis, and DNA samples were extracted from various pieces of evidence for comparison against potential suspects. The brutality of the crime shocked even experienced homicide investigators. Detective Lieutenant Jack Fitzpatrick, who had worked numerous murder cases during his career, would later describe the Sarah Good case as one of the most savage he had encountered. The level of violence suggested a killer who was either completely without empathy or someone who had been consumed by rage to the point of losing all self-control. As word of the autopsy results spread through the law enforcement community, it became clear that finding Sarah's killer was not just a matter of justice, it was a matter of public safety. Someone capable of such extreme violence was almost certainly a danger to others, and the clock was ticking to identify and apprehend the perpetrator before they could strike again. With Sarah's body recovered and the autopsy complete, Suffolk County detectives shifted into the methodical phase of homicide investigation that often determines whether a case will be solved or remain forever cold. The evidence they had collected painted a disturbing picture, but translating that evidence into an arrest would require careful detective work and more than a little luck. The bloody handprint on Sarah's car became the focal point of the forensic investigation. Crime lab technicians worked to enhance the print, looking for the distinctive ridge patterns and minutiae that could definitively identify the person who had left it. Simultaneously, DNA extraction was attempted from the blood, hoping to develop a genetic profile of the killer. Investigators also focused intensively on reconstructing the timeline of June 6 and early June 7. They interviewed dozens of people who had been at the party, creating a detailed map of who was there, when they arrived, when they left, and most importantly, who they saw Sarah interacting with during the evening. This process revealed that Sarah had indeed exchanged contact information with several people at the party, including Dante Taylor. Cell phone records, obtained through search warrants, showed a pattern of communication between Sarah and Taylor that evening. The calls and text messages began during the party and continued after most attendees had gone home. The content of these communications would become crucial evidence in the case that was building against Taylor. While the exact text of the messages was not released publicly during the investigation, sources close to the case suggested they showed Taylor attempting to arrange a meeting with Sarah after the party had ended. Investigators also began building a profile of Dante Taylor himself. At 19, he was a former Marine who had served briefly before being discharged. Friends and acquaintances described him as someone who could be charming when he wanted to be, but who also had a darker side that sometimes emerged, particularly in his interactions with women. Taylor's history included some minor run-ins with law enforcement, though nothing that would have predicted the level of violence seen in Sarah's murder. He lived in Mastic, a community about 15 minutes from Medford, and worked occasionally in construction and landscaping jobs. As detectives dug deeper into Taylor's background, they discovered a pattern of behavior that troubled them. Several young women reported that Taylor had made them uncomfortable at various social gatherings, describing him as someone who didn't seem to understand or respect boundaries. While none of these incidents had risen to the level of criminal behavior, they painted a picture of someone who viewed women as objects rather than individuals deserving of respect. The investigation also revealed that Taylor had specifically asked about Sarah at the party, inquiring about her relationship status and whether she was available. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Taylor had seemed particularly interested in Sarah throughout the evening, often positioning himself near her during conversations and attempting to engage her in private discussions. Perhaps most significantly, investigators discovered that Taylor had left the party shortly after Sarah, despite having arrived with friends who stayed much later. When questioned about his early departure, Taylor initially claimed he had felt sick and wanted to go home. Later, he changed his story, saying he had received a phone call that required him to leave. These inconsistencies in Taylor's account of the evening, combined with the physical evidence and witness statements, began to paint a clear picture for investigators. Sarah had left the party alone, but she had not been alone for long. The investigation into Sarah Good's murder took a significant turn in July 2014, more than a month after her body was discovered. While detectives had been building their case against Dante Taylor, they were still waiting for crucial forensic results that would either confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. The breakthrough came when DNA analysis of evidence collected from both Sarah's body and her vehicle was completed. The results were unambiguous. Genetic material found at the crime scene matched Dante Taylor's DNA profile. This physical evidence, combined with the circumstantial evidence investigators had been gathering, provided the foundation for an arrest warrant. But when Suffolk County detectives went to arrest Taylor at his Mastic home, they discovered he was no longer on Long Island. Taylor had fled to Florida, a move that investigators interpreted as consciousness of guilt. Someone innocent of murder would not typically leave town while police were investigating a crime they had been questioned about. The manhunt for Taylor extended across state lines, with Long Island detectives coordinating with Florida law enforcement to locate and apprehend the suspect. Taylor was eventually tracked down and arrested on an unrelated warrant, but once in custody, he was formally charged with the murder of Sarah Good. The arrest brought a measure of relief to Sarah's family and the Medford community, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase of their ordeal. Now they would have to endure the lengthy process of prosecution, including a trial that would force them to relive the details of Sarah's death in excruciating detail. When Taylor was extradited back to Long Island, he was formally arraigned in Suffolk County Court on charges of second-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for what would become a complex and emotionally charged legal battle. The arrest also revealed additional details about the crime that made it even more disturbing. Prosecutors alleged that Taylor had followed Sarah when she left the party, either in his own vehicle or by convincing her to give him a ride. At some point during this encounter, Taylor had made sexual advances toward Sarah, and when she rejected him, he had flown into a violent rage. The evidence suggested that the initial assault had taken place in or near Sarah's car, which explained the blood found in the vehicle. Taylor had then moved Sarah to the secluded wooded area where her body was eventually discovered, either to continue the assault or to dispose of evidence. The level of planning involved in the crime was a subject of debate among investigators. Some believed the murder was a spontaneous act of violence triggered by Sarah's rejection of Taylor's advances. Others argued that Taylor's behavior at the party and his decision to follow Sarah suggested a degree of premeditation. Regardless of whether the crime was planned or impulsive, the evidence was clear that Taylor had committed an act of extraordinary violence against a young woman whose only mistake had been attending a party and being friendly to someone she barely knew. The legal proceedings in the case of People vs. Dante Taylor began in earnest in 2015, as prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared for what everyone knew would be a high-profile and emotionally charged trial. The case had captured the attention of the Long Island community, both because of the brutal nature of the crime and because Sarah Good had become a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare. The prosecution, led by the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, built their case around three main pillars of evidence: the physical DNA evidence linking Taylor to the crime, the cell phone records showing communication between Taylor and Sarah on the night of the murder, and the pattern of behavior witnesses had observed at the party. The DNA evidence was particularly compelling. Forensic scientists had found Taylor's genetic material on Sarah's body, confirming that sexual contact had occurred between them. The prosecution argued that this contact was not consensual and was part of the violent assault that led to Sarah's death. The cell phone records provided crucial timeline evidence. The data showed that Taylor and Sarah had exchanged calls and text messages during and after the party, with the last communication occurring in the early morning hours of June 7. The prosecution used this evidence to argue that Taylor had arranged to meet Sarah after the party, setting up the encounter that would lead to her death. Perhaps most damaging to Taylor's case was the testimony of party attendees who described his behavior toward Sarah during the evening. Multiple witnesses testified that Taylor had seemed obsessed with Sarah, following her around the party and making repeated attempts to engage her in private conversation despite her apparent lack of interest. The defense team, faced with overwhelming physical evidence, adopted a strategy that acknowledged Taylor had been with Sarah on the night of her death but argued that the sexual contact between them had been consensual. They contended that someone else had murdered Sarah after Taylor left her, though they were unable to provide any evidence to support this theory or identify an alternative suspect. This defense strategy was risky, as it required the jury to believe that Sarah had willingly engaged in sexual contact with Taylor but had then encountered another killer in the brief window between Taylor's departure and her death. The prosecution effectively dismantled this argument by pointing out the lack of any evidence for a second perpetrator and the statistical improbability of such a scenario. The trial also featured emotional testimony from Sarah's family members, who described the devastating impact her death had on her young daughter and the entire family. Jocelyn, who was only 4 years old when her mother was murdered, had struggled to understand why her mommy wasn't coming home, adding another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking case. Expert witnesses testified about the nature of Sarah's injuries, explaining to the jury that the 40-plus stab wounds indicated a level of violence that went far beyond what would have been necessary to cause death. This overkill was consistent with a crime of passion or rage, supporting the prosecution's theory that Taylor had murdered Sarah when she rejected his advances. The trial lasted several weeks, with both sides presenting detailed arguments about the evidence and its interpretation. The prosecution painted Taylor as a dangerous predator who had targeted Sarah because he saw her as vulnerable in the aftermath of her recent breakup. The defense continued to maintain that Taylor was innocent of murder, though their alternative theories failed to gain traction with the jury. On June 16, 2016, after deliberating for 2 days, the jury returned their verdict in the case against Dante Taylor. The 12 men and women who had listened to weeks of testimony and examined hundreds of pieces of evidence reached a unanimous conclusion: Dante Taylor was guilty of murdering Sarah Good. The conviction was on charges of first-degree murder and attempted rape, reflecting the jury's conclusion that Taylor had not only killed Sarah but had done so in the commission of another felony. This conviction carried with it the possibility of life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under New York state law. When the verdict was announced, Sarah's family members, who had endured more than 2 years of legal proceedings while struggling to raise her daughter and heal from their loss, openly wept in the courtroom. The conviction represented not just legal justice, but a validation that Sarah's life had mattered and that her killer would be held accountable for his actions. Taylor showed little emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same detached demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. His family members, who had stood by him despite the overwhelming evidence, appeared devastated by the outcome. On July 29, 2016, Dante Taylor was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Fernando Camacho, in announcing the sentence, spoke directly to the brutality of the crime and its impact on Sarah's family and community. The judge noted that the evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of a crime that was both premeditated and exceptionally violent. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to Sarah's family, though they would be the first to acknowledge that no legal outcome could truly heal the wound left by her death. Sarah's sister had become Jocelyn's primary caregiver, ensuring that the little girl would grow up surrounded by love and memories of her mother. In victim impact statements read during the sentencing hearing, Sarah's family described the ongoing trauma of losing her. They spoke about Jocelyn's confusion and grief, about family gatherings that would forever feel incomplete, and about the simple daily moments, bedtime stories, school events, birthday parties, that Sarah would never experience with her daughter. The case also had broader implications for the Long Island community. It served as a stark reminder that violence against women remains a persistent problem in American society, and that seemingly safe environments like suburban house parties can become dangerous when the wrong person decides to act on violent impulses. Local domestic violence organizations used Sarah's case to highlight the importance of recognizing warning signs of potentially dangerous behavior and the need for better education about consent and respect in relationships. While Sarah's murder was not technically domestic violence, she and Taylor were not in a relationship. The dynamics of the crime shared many characteristics with intimate partner violence. The story of Sarah Good's murder officially concluded in October 2017, when news broke that Dante Taylor had been found dead in his prison cell. The circumstances of his death were not immediately clear, but the result was the same: the man who had brutally ended Sarah's life was himself dead, bringing an unexpected final chapter to a case that had already seen justice served. Taylor's death in prison occurred just over a year after his sentencing, during what should have been the beginning of a life sentence behind bars. Some viewed his death as a form of cosmic justice, arguing that someone who had shown such complete disregard for human life deserved no better fate. Others saw it as a tragedy that prevented any possibility of Taylor someday providing answers to questions that still haunted Sarah's family. For Sarah's family, Taylor's death was a complex development. On one hand, it meant they would never have to worry about appeals, parole hearings, or any possibility of Taylor ever being released from prison. On the other hand, it closed the door on any chance of understanding why he had committed such a brutal crime or whether he felt any remorse for his actions. Jocelyn Good, who was 7 years old when Taylor died, was being raised by her aunt with the help of Sarah's extended family and friends. The little girl was thriving in school and had been receiving counseling to help her process the trauma of losing her mother at such a young age. Family members were committed to ensuring that Jocelyn grew up knowing how much her mother had loved her and what a special person Sarah had been. The case left lasting impacts on the Medford community as well. The house where the party had been held was eventually sold, and the new owners were reportedly unaware of its connection to the tragedy. The wooded area where Sarah's body was found became an unofficial memorial site, where friends and family would sometimes leave flowers or simply come to remember her. Local law enforcement used the Sarah Good case as a training example for young officers, demonstrating how a combination of solid detective work, community cooperation, and forensic science could solve even the most challenging homicides. The case also highlighted the importance of taking missing person reports seriously, particularly when they involve responsible adults who would not normally disappear without explanation. The investigation had taken detectives through every aspect of Sarah's life, ultimately revealing a young woman who had been beloved by everyone who knew her. She had been a dedicated mother, a reliable employee, and a loyal friend. Her only mistake had been trusting someone who turned out to be a monster. In the years since her death, Sarah's story has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries and podcasts, ensuring that her memory lives on and that others can learn from the tragedy that befell her. These retellings always emphasize not just the horror of her death, but the fullness of her life, her dreams for the future, her love for her daughter, and her impact on everyone around her. As we conclude this examination of the Sarah Good murder case, it's important to remember that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life was cut short by violence. Sarah was not just a victim in a criminal case, she was a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a friend whose absence continues to be felt by those who loved her. The case demonstrates both the best and worst of human nature. The worst was embodied by Dante Taylor, who allowed his selfish desires and violent impulses to destroy an innocent life. The best was seen in the community response to Sarah's disappearance, the dedication of law enforcement officers who worked tirelessly to solve her murder, and the love and support that surrounded her daughter in the aftermath of the tragedy. Today, Jocelyn is growing up in a world where her mother exists only in photographs and memories, but she is surrounded by people who are committed to ensuring that Sarah's love continues to shape her life. The family has established traditions to keep Sarah's memory alive, celebrating her birthday each year, visiting places she loved, and sharing stories about the kind of person she was. The Sarah Good case serves as a reminder that violence against women is not just a statistic, it's a reality that tears apart families and communities. It also demonstrates that when law enforcement, forensic science, and community support work together, justice can be achieved even in the most challenging cases. For those who investigate such crimes, the case represents the importance of thorough, methodical police work and the power of modern forensic science to identify perpetrators even when they believe they have covered their tracks. For the general public, it serves as a sobering reminder to trust their instincts about people who make them uncomfortable and to look out for one another in social situations. The woods where Sarah's body was found have returned to their natural quiet, disturbed only by the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But for those who knew and loved Sarah Good, the echoes of her laughter, her voice calling to her daughter, and her dreams for the future continue to resonate. In the end, Sarah's story is both an ending and a beginning. It's the end of a life filled with promise and potential, cut short by senseless violence. But it's also the beginning of a legacy, a reminder that every life has value, that justice is worth fighting for, and that love transcends even death itself. As we turn off the lights and prepare for sleep, we remember Sarah Good not as a victim, but as a young woman who lived fully in her 21 years, who loved deeply, and who continues to inspire others through the memory of who she was and who she might have become. Rest in peace, Sarah. Your story has been told, your killer brought to justice, and your memory preserved. And somewhere in Long Island, a young girl is growing up knowing that her mother was loved, that her mother mattered, and that her mother's spirit lives on in all the lives she touched. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey to Spokane, Washington, to explore a case that demonstrates how quickly trust can turn deadly, and how the most intimate relationships can harbor the darkest secrets. In the summer of 2020, as the world grappled with uncertainty and isolation, a unique living arrangement was taking place in a modest home at 903 East Princeton Avenue in Spokane's Nevada Heights neighborhood. It was here that 25-year-old Anthony Brines found himself sharing a roof with his estranged wife and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Edward Martinez. To most people, this arrangement might seem unusual, even uncomfortable. But Anthony was a man known for his kindness, his willingness to help others, and his belief in the goodness of people. Those who knew him described him as someone who would extend trust and friendship even in the most complex situations. Perhaps it was this very nature that led him to this unconventional living situation, and perhaps, tragically, it was this same trusting spirit that would ultimately cost him his life. Anthony Brines had been married, but like many marriages, his had reached its end. Divorce proceedings were underway, but in a twist that speaks to either his generous nature or the complicated realities of modern life, he had agreed to share his home with his estranged wife and her new boyfriend. For nearly 3 months, from June through August 2020, this arrangement seemed to work. There were no reported conflicts, no violent outbursts, no signs of the horror that was to come. Edward Martinez, the boyfriend, was young, just 19 years old. The age gap between him and Anthony might have created natural tension, but by all accounts, the three adults had found a way to coexist peacefully. They shared meals, conversations, and the mundane details of daily life. It was, on the surface, a modern example of how people might navigate the complexities of relationships and living situations in the 21st century. August 13, 2020, began like many summer evenings in Spokane. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the Nevada Heights neighborhood. Inside the house on East Princeton Avenue, the three residents were settling into what would become their final evening together. They had been drinking, not heavily, but enough to lower inhibitions and perhaps cloud judgment. Alcohol has a way of making people more open to suggestion, more willing to explore boundaries they might normally respect. And it was in this slightly intoxicated state that the three adults made a decision that would change everything. Someone suggested they play with a Ouija board. For those unfamiliar, a Ouija board is a flat board marked with letters, numbers, and other symbols, supposedly used to communicate with spirits. Whether you believe in such things or not, the board serves as a kind of icebreaker, a way for people to feel connected to something mysterious and otherworldly. In this case, it may have served as a prelude to other intimate connections. As the evening progressed and the alcohol continued to flow, the conversation took a more intimate turn. Boundaries that had been carefully maintained during their months of cohabitation began to blur. What exactly was said, who made the first suggestion, we may never know with complete certainty. But at some point that evening, the three adults agreed to something that would prove fatal. They decided to move from the living room to the master bedroom. They decided to cross the line from roommates to something far more intimate and complicated. They agreed to have sex together. In the master bedroom, with its familiar furniture and personal belongings, the three adults began what they thought would be a consensual adult encounter. But human sexuality, particularly when it involves multiple people, can be unpredictable. Emotions that seem manageable in theory can become overwhelming in practice. According to court testimony and police interviews, Edward Martinez and his girlfriend attempted to be intimate first, but something went wrong. Perhaps it was nervousness, perhaps it was the alcohol, perhaps it was the unusual nature of the situation itself. Whatever the reason, Martinez was unable to perform sexually with his girlfriend. In a moment that would prove catastrophic, Anthony Bryan stepped in. Whether invited or whether he took initiative himself, Anthony began having sexual relations with the woman, his estranged wife, Martinez's girlfriend, while Martinez watched. For Martinez, this moment became unbearable. Here he was, a 19-year-old young man, forced to watch as his girlfriend had sex with another man. But this wasn't just any other man, this was her husband, albeit estranged. The psychological complexity of the situation was staggering. Martinez was witnessing his girlfriend with her husband, in what was supposed to be a shared experience but had become, from his perspective, a moment of profound humiliation and exclusion. Something in Martinez's mind snapped. The jealousy, the humiliation, the anger, it all coalesced into a moment of pure rage. Without warning, without discussion, Martinez got up and left the bedroom. The woman, engaged with Anthony, may not have immediately noticed Martinez's departure. But Martinez wasn't leaving the house. He was going to the kitchen. In the kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary implements of daily life, dishes, utensils, appliances, Martinez's hand found a knife. It was a weapon that had been used countless times for innocent purposes, cutting vegetables, slicing meat, preparing meals for the three residents of the house. Now it would serve a far darker purpose. Martinez gripped the knife and returned to the master bedroom. Anthony Bryan, still engaged with the woman, was completely vulnerable. He had no reason to expect violence. They were all adults who had consensually agreed to this situation. There had been no threats, no arguments, no signs of impending danger. Martinez approached from behind. Without warning, without giving Anthony a chance to defend himself or even understand what was happening, Martinez drove the knife into Anthony's back. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, the blade pierced Anthony's flesh again and again. The pain must have been excruciating and shocking. Anthony fell backward, no longer able to maintain his position. Blood began to flow, soaking into the bed sheets and carpet. The woman screamed, the intimate atmosphere destroyed in an instant by the reality of violence. But Martinez wasn't finished. As Anthony fell onto his back, wounded but still alive, still conscious, Martinez continued his assault. Anthony, fighting for his life, tried to defend himself. He raised his hands, tried to push Martinez away, tried to protect himself from the continuing attack. It was futile. Martinez, driven by rage and adrenaline, continued to stab. The knife found its target 15 more times, striking Anthony's chest, his arms, even his face. Each wound was a decision, a conscious choice to continue the violence. This wasn't a single moment of rage, it was a sustained and brutal attack. 20 stab wounds in total. 20 separate moments when Martinez chose to continue killing rather than stop. 20 times the knife pierced flesh, drawing blood, causing pain, ending a life. Anthony Brines, just 25 years old, died in that bedroom, on what should have been a night of adult pleasure but became a scene of unspeakable violence. His blood stained the room where he had lived peacefully for months, where he had tried to make an unconventional situation work through kindness and trust. As Anthony lay dying, Martinez turned to the woman, the witness to this horror, the person around whom this entire tragedy had revolved. Perhaps realizing the magnitude of what he had done, perhaps still driven by the same impulses that led to the murder, Martinez tried to convince her to flee with him. He had just killed her husband, and now he wanted her to become his accomplice in escape. But the woman, traumatized by what she had witnessed, refused. Despite whatever feelings she may have had for Martinez, despite their relationship, she could not become party to covering up this murder. Instead, she made the decision that would lead to justice for Anthony Brines. She called the police. When the 911 call came in, the dispatcher heard a woman's voice, shaken and terrified, reporting that her boyfriend had stabbed her ex-husband multiple times and then fled the scene. The Spokane Police Department immediately dispatched officers to the address on East Princeton Avenue. What they found was a scene of carnage. Anthony Brines was still alive when first responders arrived, but barely. He had lost massive amounts of blood from 20 stab wounds. The bedroom looked like a battlefield, with blood soaked into every surface. Paramedics worked frantically to save Anthony's life, but the damage was too extensive. He died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Meanwhile, police had set up a perimeter around the neighborhood, knowing that Martinez was on foot and likely still in the area. They didn't have to wait long. A citizen called in a tip, reporting the location of a young man who matched Martinez's description. Officers found Edward Martinez just 10 blocks away from the scene of the murder. He was arrested without incident. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation. Martinez, perhaps exhausted by the violence he had committed, perhaps in shock at his own actions, simply surrendered. He was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. In the hours and days that followed, investigators began piecing together the events of that terrible evening. The woman who had witnessed the murder provided detailed testimony about the evening's progression, from the drinking and Ouija board to the sexual encounter to the sudden explosion of violence. Martinez himself admitted to the stabbing during police interviews. There was no denial, no claim of innocence. He acknowledged that he had killed Anthony Brines, though his explanations for why would vary and evolve over time. The investigation revealed the complex dynamics of the living situation. Neighbors reported that the 3 residents seemed to get along well, with no signs of conflict or tension. There had been no domestic violence calls to the address, no complaints about noise or disturbances. By all external appearances, the arrangement had been working. This made the murder all the more shocking. This wasn't the culmination of months of building tension or escalating conflict. It was a sudden explosion of violence triggered by a specific moment of jealousy and rage. Forensic examination of the scene confirmed the brutality of the attack. 20 stab wounds, delivered with significant force, showed that this was not a crime of passion in the sense of a single moment of poor judgment. This was sustained violence, requiring numerous conscious decisions to continue the attack even after Anthony was clearly mortally wounded. The medical examiner's report made clear that Anthony had tried to defend himself. Defensive wounds on his hands and arms showed that he had been conscious and fighting for his life during at least part of the attack. His final moments were spent in terror and pain, trying desperately to survive an assault from someone he had trusted enough to share his home with. Edward Martinez was held in the Spokane County Jail while prosecutors prepared their case. Given the circumstances of the crime, the premeditation implied by leaving the bedroom to get a knife, the extreme brutality of 20 stab wounds, and Martinez's own admission, the case against him was strong. Martinez's defense attorneys faced a difficult task. Their client had admitted to the killing, there was a witness, and the physical evidence was overwhelming. Their strategy would have to focus not on innocence, but on trying to minimize the charges or the potential sentence. The prosecution, led by Deputy Prosecutor, painted a picture of a brutal and calculated murder. They argued that Martinez's decision to leave the bedroom, get a knife, and return to continue the attack showed premeditation. The 20 stab wounds demonstrated extreme cruelty and a complete disregard for human life. The defense might have argued that this was a crime of passion, that Martinez was overwhelmed by jealousy and acted in the heat of the moment. But the sustained nature of the attack, 20 separate stab wounds, made this argument difficult to sustain. As the case moved through the court system, Anthony Brine's family had to grapple with their loss. They had lost a son, a brother, a man known for his kindness and generosity. His brother Christopher, who shared the same birthday with Anthony, would later speak about how that date had been forever changed, transformed from a day of celebration into an annual reminder of loss. When the case finally went to trial in 2023, nearly 3 years after Anthony's murder, the courtroom was packed with family members, friends, and members of the community seeking justice. The trial would force everyone to relive the horrible events of that August evening, to hear in detail about the moments leading up to Anthony's death and the brutal nature of his killing. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They called the woman who had witnessed the murder to testify about the events of that evening. Her testimony was crucial, as she was the only living person who had seen exactly what happened in that bedroom. She described the drinking, the Ouija board, the decision to engage in sexual activity. She testified about Martinez's inability to perform sexually and Anthony's subsequent involvement with her. She described Martinez leaving the bedroom and returning with the knife. Most importantly, she testified about the sustained and brutal nature of the attack, confirming that this was not a single moment of violence but a prolonged assault. The medical examiner testified about Anthony's injuries, detailing each of the 20 stab wounds. The testimony was clinical but devastating, painting a picture of extreme violence and suffering. The forensic evidence supported the witness testimony, confirming the brutal nature of the attack. Martinez's own admissions to police were introduced as evidence. His acknowledgement that he had committed the murder eliminated any possibility of arguing innocence. The defense was left to argue for lesser charges or mitigating circumstances. The defense tried to portray Martinez as a young man overwhelmed by jealousy and rage, acting in a moment of passion. They may have argued that the unusual nature of the sexual encounter had created an emotionally charged situation that led to tragedy. But the prosecution countered with the premeditated nature of the attack. Martinez had left the bedroom, gone to the kitchen, selected a weapon, and returned to commit murder. The 20 stab wounds showed that he had numerous opportunities to stop, to reconsider, to choose a different path. Instead, he had chosen to continue the violence until Anthony was dead. After hearing all the evidence, the jury deliberated on Edward Martinez's fate. They had to weigh the complexity of the situation against the brutality of the crime. They had to consider Martinez's youth and the unusual circumstances while also considering the horrific nature of Anthony's death. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found Edward Martinez guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Anthony Brines. The verdict brought some measure of justice for Anthony's family and friends, though nothing could truly compensate for their loss. The conviction meant that Martinez would face a significant prison sentence. First-degree murder carries severe penalties, reflecting society's judgment that taking another person's life is among the most serious crimes possible. The sentencing phase of the case provided an opportunity for Anthony's family to address the court and Martinez directly. These victim impact statements are often the most emotional part of any murder trial, as they give voice to the grief and loss that the crime has caused. Christopher Walker, Anthony's brother, spoke about how the murder had affected his family. He talked about sharing a birthday with Anthony and how that special day had been forever changed by the tragedy. He spoke about Anthony's kindness, his willingness to help others, and the hole his death had left in their lives. Other family members and friends also addressed the court, painting a picture of Anthony as a generous, trusting man who had tried to make the best of a difficult situation. They described his willingness to share his home with his estranged wife and her boyfriend, seeing it as an example of his generous nature rather than poor judgment. When it came time for sentencing, Judge John Cooney had to consider not just the crime itself but Martinez's age and circumstances. Martinez was still very young, just 22 years old at the time of sentencing. He had committed this crime when he was only 19, barely an adult. But the judge also had to consider the brutal nature of the murder and the impact on Anthony's family and community. 20 stab wounds represent 20 decisions to continue killing. The sustained nature of the violence showed a level of cruelty that demanded severe punishment. In July 2023, Judge Cooney sentenced Edward Martinez to 27 years in prison for the murder of Anthony Brines. It was a significant sentence, reflecting the serious nature of the crime while also acknowledging Martinez's youth. At 22, Martinez would spend more than half of his life behind bars, not eligible for release until he was nearly 50 years old. The Anthony Brines murder case raises difficult questions about human nature, relationships, and the thin line between civilization and violence. How does a living situation that worked peacefully for months suddenly explode into deadly violence? What drives someone from jealousy to murder in a matter of minutes? The case also highlights the complexities of modern relationships. In an era when traditional family structures are evolving, when people are experimenting with new forms of living arrangements and intimate relationships, this case serves as a tragic reminder that human emotions, jealousy, rage, possessiveness, remain as powerful and dangerous as ever. Anthony Brines' willingness to share his home with his estranged wife and her boyfriend can be seen as either admirable generosity or poor judgment. Perhaps it was both. His trusting nature, which led him to believe this arrangement could work, may have been the same quality that made him vulnerable to Martinez's attack. The case also raises questions about consent and boundaries in intimate relationships. The three adults had agreed to engage in sexual activity together, but the emotional reality of that decision proved far more complex than any of them had anticipated. What seemed like a simple adult decision became a trigger for deadly violence. Edward Martinez's transformation from peaceful roommate to brutal killer happened in a matter of minutes. This rapid escalation from normalcy to violence is one of the most disturbing aspects of many murder cases. It reminds us how quickly human beings can cross lines they never imagined crossing. Jealousy is one of the oldest and most powerful human emotions. It has driven people to violence throughout history, across all cultures and social classes. In Martinez's case, the jealousy was likely compounded by humiliation. Not only was he watching his girlfriend with another man, but he had been unable to perform sexually himself, adding embarrassment to his emotional turmoil. The decision to get a knife shows that Martinez's violence was not purely impulsive. He made a conscious choice to arm himself, to escalate the situation to potentially deadly force. This moment of decision is crucial in understanding the crime. Martinez could have chosen to leave the house, to end the sexual encounter, to confront Anthony verbally. Instead, he chose violence. The sustained nature of the attack, 20 stab wounds, suggests that Martinez was driven by more than just momentary rage. Each additional stab wound was a decision to continue the violence, to ensure Anthony's death. This level of brutality indicates a complete breakdown of normal human empathy and restraint. In the aftermath of such brutal crimes, it's important to remember that behind the legal proceedings and media coverage was a real person with a real life cut short. Anthony Brines was 25 years old when he died, with decades of life ahead of him. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. Those who knew Anthony described him as kind and generous, qualities that were evident in his willingness to share his home with his estranged wife and her boyfriend. He was trying to navigate a complex situation with grace and maturity, attempting to maintain civility even as his marriage ended. Anthony's decision to trust Martinez, to welcome him into his home, and to believe that adults could handle complex intimate situations with maturity, ultimately cost him his life. But these decisions also speak to his character. He was someone who believed in the goodness of people, who was willing to extend trust even in difficult circumstances. His family's grief is compounded by the senseless nature of his death. Anthony didn't die in an accident or from an illness. He died because someone he trusted chose violence over communication, murder over walking away. The randomness and brutality of his death make it that much harder for those who loved him to find peace. The murder of Anthony Brines sent shockwaves through Spokane's Nevada Heights neighborhood and the broader community. Residents had to grapple with the reality that such violence could occur in their midst, in a quiet residential area where people felt safe. The case also highlighted issues around domestic violence and relationship complexity. While this wasn't a traditional domestic violence case, it occurred within the context of intimate relationships and shared living spaces. It reminded people that violence can emerge from situations that seem consensual and controlled. Local law enforcement praised the quick response of officers and the cooperation of the witness in ensuring Martinez's arrest. The fact that he was captured just 10 blocks from the crime scene, thanks to a citizen tip, showed the community working together to ensure justice for Anthony. As we reflect on this tragic case, several lessons emerge. The most obvious is the dangerous nature of unchecked jealousy and rage. Martinez's inability to control his emotions led to consequences that destroyed multiple lives, Anthony's, his own, and those of everyone who loved both men. The case also serves as a reminder that complex living arrangements and intimate relationships require careful navigation. What seems manageable in theory can become overwhelming in practice. Clear communication, established boundaries, and honest assessment of everyone's emotional capacity are crucial when people choose to explore non-traditional relationship dynamics. Perhaps most importantly, the case reminds us of the preciousness and fragility of human life. Anthony Brines trusted Martinez enough to share his home with him for months. He extended hospitality and friendship to someone who ultimately killed him. This betrayal of trust makes the crime even more tragic. Edward Martinez will spend the next 27 years in prison, beginning his incarceration as a young man and emerging, if he serves his full sentence, as someone approaching 50. He will have decades to contemplate the few minutes that changed everything, the moment when jealousy overwhelmed judgment and led to murder. Anthony Brines will never have the chance to see what his life might have become. At 25, he was still discovering who he was, what he wanted, how he might contribute to the world. His family and friends are left with memories and what-ifs, wondering about the man he might have become and the life he might have lived. The woman who witnessed the murder must live with the trauma of what she saw, the knowledge that her relationships with both men led to this tragedy. Her decision to call police rather than flee with Martinez was crucial in ensuring justice for Anthony, but she will carry the psychological scars of that night for the rest of her life. As we consider this case in the quiet hours when sleep eludes us, we're reminded of the complex nature of human relationships and the thin line between civilization and violence. We're reminded that trust, while essential to human connection, can also make us vulnerable to those who would betray it. Most of all, we're reminded that every life has value, that every person deserves to live free from violence, and that when someone chooses murder over other alternatives, the consequences ripple outward, affecting families, communities, and society as a whole. The Anthony Brines murder case is a tragedy born of jealousy, rage, and poor decision-making. It's a reminder that even in the most modern and seemingly enlightened times, the ancient human capacity for violence remains with us, requiring constant vigilance and the conscious choice, moment by moment, to choose compassion over cruelty, communication over conflict, and life over death. In remembering Anthony Brines, we honor not just his memory but the principle that every human life is precious, that trust and kindness are qualities worth preserving, and that justice, while it cannot restore what was lost, serves as society's declaration that such violence will not go unpunished. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for Anthony Brines, a young man whose life was cut short by someone he trusted, someone he tried to help, someone who repaid his generosity with the ultimate betrayal. His story serves as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder of the best and worst of human nature, and the consequences when the worst overwhelms the best. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to Aurora, Colorado, where the quiet suburban streets hide a story that shook an entire community. This is the case of Joseph Castorina, a young man whose inability to accept rejection led to one of the most devastating domestic violence-related mass murders in recent Colorado history. As you settle in for the night, let me tell you about a case that demonstrates how quickly love can turn to obsession, and obsession to unthinkable violence. The autumn of 2022 was drawing to a close in Aurora, Colorado's third-largest city. The leaves had turned their brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and residents were preparing for the approaching winter. In a modest home on Galena Street, near the intersection of East 10th Avenue and Geneva Street, a family was going about their daily routines, unaware that their lives were about to be forever changed. Joseph Castorina was 22 years old, a young man at the crossroads of life where most people his age are figuring out their careers, their relationships, their place in the world. But Joseph was struggling with something far more dangerous than typical young adult uncertainty. He was grappling with an obsession that had consumed his thoughts and was rapidly spiraling out of control. The object of this obsession was his ex-girlfriend, a young woman who had made the difficult decision to end their relationship. Domestic violence experts often say that the most dangerous time for a victim is when they try to leave their abuser, and this case would prove that warning tragically correct. Joseph's ex-girlfriend had found the strength to walk away from what had become an unhealthy and frightening relationship. She had the support of her family, particularly her relatives who lived in the house on Galena Street. This family support system, which should have been her safety net, would instead become the target of Joseph's escalating rage. The relationship between Joseph and his ex-girlfriend had not ended amicably. According to court records and testimony, Joseph had become increasingly possessive and controlling. When she decided to end things, he couldn't accept her decision. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, then perhaps no one could help her, protect her, or support her. The family members living in the Galena Street home had witnessed Joseph's behavior firsthand. They had seen how he treated their daughter, their sister, their relative. They had likely encouraged her to leave him, supported her decision to break free from what was clearly becoming a dangerous situation. In Joseph's twisted logic, they were obstacles to what he believed was rightfully his. As October 2022 progressed, Joseph's behavior became increasingly erratic and threatening. His ex-girlfriend and her family members were frightened enough to take legal action. On October 24, just 6 days before the tragedy would unfold, 2 of the victims filed restraining orders against Joseph Castorina. These protective orders were a clear signal that Joseph's behavior had crossed the line from persistent to threatening. The family feared for their safety enough to involve the legal system, hoping that official documentation would either deter Joseph or provide them with recourse if his behavior escalated further. Restraining orders, also known as protective orders, are legal documents that prohibit one person from contacting, approaching, or harming another. They're often sought by victims of domestic violence, stalking, or harassment. In theory, they provide protection by making it illegal for the perpetrator to come near their victim. In practice, however, they're only as effective as the person's willingness to abide by them. For Joseph Castorina, these protective orders weren't a wake-up call or a deterrent. Instead, they seemed to serve as confirmation that he was losing control over the situation, that his ex-girlfriend and her family were moving further away from his influence. This may have accelerated his timeline for action. The filing of these protective orders placed the family's concerns on record with law enforcement. They had done everything they were supposed to do within the legal system. They had recognized the danger, documented it, and sought official protection. It should have been enough to keep them safe. But protective orders are ultimately just pieces of paper, and they cannot stop someone who is determined to cause harm. During this time, Joseph was likely planning. Domestic violence experts recognize a pattern in these cases. When the victim tries to establish independence or seek help, the abuser often escalates their tactics. The protective orders may have represented, to Joseph, a point of no return. If he couldn't intimidate them back into compliance, he might have decided that more drastic action was necessary. October 30, 2022, fell on a Sunday. It was the night before Halloween, a time when most people were thinking about costume parties, trick-or-treating, and the fun scares that come with the holiday. In the house on Galena Street, the residents were likely settling in for a quiet evening at home. The house was occupied by several family members, all adults who had created a support system for each other. There was Jesus Serrano, a 51-year-old man who was likely a father figure in the family. Maria Anita Serrano, just 22 years old, was close in age to Joseph himself, representing a life full of potential that had barely begun to unfold. Kenneth Eugene Green Luque, 21, was the youngest of the group, perhaps a brother or cousin, still in the early years of his adult life. Finally, there was Rudolfo Salgado Perez, 59, who at nearly 60 had accumulated decades of life experience, wisdom, and relationships. These were not random victims. They were specifically targeted because of their connection to Joseph's ex-girlfriend. In his mind, they represented the support system that had helped her leave him, the people who had encouraged her to file protective orders, the family who stood between him and what he wanted. As the evening progressed, Joseph made his way to the house on Galena Street. Whether he had been watching the house, planning this attack for days, or whether it was a more impulsive decision driven by rage, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that he came armed and with deadly intent. The attack itself was swift and brutal. Joseph opened fire inside the home, methodically killing 4 people. The violence was not random or chaotic, it was targeted and efficient. Each victim was someone Joseph saw as an obstacle to his goals, someone who had played a role in his ex-girlfriend's decision to leave him. Jesus Serrano, Maria Anita Serrano, Kenneth Eugene Green Luque, and Rudolfo Salgado Perez were all killed that night. Their lives, with all their hopes, dreams, relationships, and experiences, were ended by a young man who couldn't accept that he didn't have the right to control another person's choices. But Joseph's violence didn't stop with these 4 murders. There was a 5th person in the house that night, someone who survived the attack. This survivor would later testify about the horror they witnessed, providing crucial evidence about what happened during those terrifying moments. After committing these murders, Joseph Castorina didn't stay to face the consequences of his actions. Instead, he fled the scene, beginning a journey that would eventually take him across international borders. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was chaotic. When police arrived at the Galena Street home, they found a scene of devastating violence. 4 people lay dead, and 1 survivor was left to deal with both physical and psychological trauma. The investigation began immediately, but the primary suspect was nowhere to be found. Joseph had evidently planned his escape route in advance, or at least had the presence of mind to disappear quickly after the shooting. Within hours of the murders, he was on his way out of Colorado, heading south toward the Mexican border. Fleeing to Mexico after committing crimes in the United States is not uncommon, particularly for suspects who have connections to the country or believe they can disappear into its vast territory. Mexico and the United States have an extradition treaty, but the process of locating, arresting, and returning fugitives can be lengthy and complicated. For Joseph, the flight to Mexico may have seemed like his only option to avoid immediate arrest. He had just committed quadruple homicide, one of the most serious crimes possible, and he knew that law enforcement would be looking for him. By crossing international borders, he was buying himself time, even if he couldn't ultimately escape justice. The weeks following the murders were undoubtedly tense for both law enforcement and the community. Aurora residents knew that a dangerous man was on the loose, someone who had demonstrated his willingness to kill multiple people in cold blood. The fact that he had fled to Mexico added an international dimension to the investigation, requiring cooperation between U.S. law enforcement and Mexican authorities. During this time, Joseph was likely moving frequently, staying off the radar, and trying to avoid detection. He may have stayed with friends or relatives, or he might have tried to blend in as just another American visitor to Mexico. Whatever his strategy, it worked for several weeks, allowing him to remain free while investigators worked tirelessly to track him down. While Joseph Castorina was hiding in Mexico, law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border were working to locate him. The Aurora Police Department, in cooperation with federal agencies and Mexican authorities, launched an intensive manhunt for the quadruple homicide suspect. International fugitive investigations require coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The FBI likely became involved due to the cross-border nature of the case, working with their Mexican counterparts to track down leads and potential sightings of the suspect. For the families of the victims, this period must have been agonizing. Not only were they grieving the loss of their loved ones, but they also had to live with the knowledge that the person responsible for their deaths was free, potentially able to harm others or simply disappear forever into another country. The investigation during this period involved analyzing evidence from the crime scene, interviewing witnesses and surviving victims, and building a comprehensive case against Joseph Castorina. Law enforcement needed to be prepared for the eventual arrest and extradition process, ensuring that they had sufficient evidence to secure a conviction once he was returned to U.S. soil. Tips and leads likely came in from various sources. Law enforcement may have monitored Joseph's known associates, financial records, and communication patterns to try to determine his whereabouts. Family members and friends might have been questioned about any contact they'd had with him since the murders. The investigation also had to consider the possibility that Joseph might try to cross back into the United States at a different location, or that he might attempt to travel to a third country. Border security agencies were undoubtedly alerted to watch for him at various crossing points. During this time, the community in Aurora was dealing with the aftermath of the tragedy. 4 people had been killed in their neighborhood, and the perpetrator was still at large. Community members might have increased their security measures, checked on their neighbors more frequently, or simply felt a general sense of unease knowing that such violence had occurred so close to home. Joseph Castorina's freedom came to an end on December 10, 2022, more than a month after the murders. Mexican authorities, working in cooperation with U.S. law enforcement, successfully located and arrested him. The arrest in Mexico marked a significant milestone in the case, but it was far from the end of the legal process. International arrests and extraditions involve complex legal procedures that can take months to complete. Joseph would need to go through the Mexican legal system before he could be returned to the United States to face charges. During his time in custody in Mexico, Joseph was likely held in a Mexican jail while extradition proceedings moved forward. This process involves both countries' legal systems verifying the charges, ensuring that the proper paperwork is filed, and confirming that the extradition treaty between the two nations applies to the specific case. For the families of the victims, Joseph's arrest was undoubtedly a relief, but it was also the beginning of a long legal journey. They knew that he would eventually face trial, but they also knew that the legal process could be lengthy and emotionally difficult. The arrest also brought some closure to the Aurora community, knowing that the dangerous fugitive who had terrorized their neighborhood was no longer free. However, the community was also preparing for the long legal battle ahead, knowing that a trial would bring renewed attention to the case and potentially reopen wounds that were just beginning to heal. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case could finally move forward with confidence, knowing that their suspect was in custody and that the evidence they had been building would be put to use in court. The successful international cooperation that led to Joseph's arrest demonstrated the effectiveness of cross-border law enforcement partnerships in pursuing justice for serious crimes. The arrest in Mexico was covered by local and national media, bringing renewed attention to the case and reminding the public of the domestic violence issues that had led to the tragedy. Domestic violence advocates used the case to highlight the dangers faced by victims who try to leave abusive relationships, and the need for better protection measures. After his arrest in Mexico, Joseph Castorena remained in custody while the complex process of extradition played out over several months. Extradition cases require coordination between judicial systems in both countries, with each step carefully documented and legally verified. The extradition process began with U.S. authorities filing formal requests with the Mexican government, providing evidence of the charges against Joseph and demonstrating that his alleged crimes met the criteria for extradition under the treaty between the two countries. Murder cases generally qualify for extradition, but the process still requires careful legal review. During this time, Joseph had the right to legal representation in Mexico and could potentially contest the extradition proceedings. Some fugitives attempt to delay or prevent their return to the United States by challenging various aspects of the extradition request, though such efforts are rarely successful in cases involving serious violent crimes. Mexican authorities had to review the evidence provided by U.S. law enforcement and ensure that the extradition request met all legal requirements. This process can take several months, during which the suspect remains in custody in Mexico. For the victims' families, this period represented another waiting game, another delay before they could see justice served. They had already waited more than a month for Joseph's arrest, and now they had to wait several more months for him to be returned to Colorado to face trial. The extradition process also involved coordination between various U.S. agencies, including the FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service, and local Colorado authorities. Plans had to be made for transporting Joseph safely back to the United States and ensuring his secure custody throughout the process. Eventually, Mexican authorities approved the extradition request, and Joseph Castorena was returned to U.S. custody. He was first taken to Arizona, where he was processed by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, before being transferred to Colorado to face charges in Arapahoe County. This international cooperation represented a successful example of cross-border law enforcement, demonstrating that suspects cannot simply flee to another country and escape justice for serious crimes committed in the United States. Once Joseph Castorena was returned to Colorado in early 2023, prosecutors began the intensive process of building their case for trial. The 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office was tasked with seeking justice for the 4 murder victims and the attempted murder survivor. The evidence against Joseph was substantial, but prosecutors knew they needed to present a comprehensive and compelling case to ensure a conviction. They had physical evidence from the crime scene, testimony from the surviving victim, and a clear motive related to the domestic violence situation that had precipitated the murders. The case was particularly significant because it highlighted the deadly consequences of domestic violence and the failure of protective orders to prevent determined perpetrators from causing harm. 2 of the victims had filed restraining orders against Joseph just 6 days before the murders, demonstrating that they were aware of the danger but unable to adequately protect themselves. prosecutors had to prepare for the possibility that Joseph's defense team would attempt various strategies to avoid or minimize the charges. They needed to anticipate potential defenses and ensure that their evidence was strong enough to counter any arguments the defense might make. The survivor of the attack would be a crucial witness, able to provide first-hand testimony about what happened during the shooting. However, prosecutors also had to be sensitive to the trauma this person had experienced and ensure that their testimony could be presented in a way that was both effective and respectful of their suffering. The domestic violence context of the case meant that prosecutors could draw on expert testimony about the patterns of behavior typical in these situations. They could explain to the jury how domestic violence often escalates when victims try to leave their abusers, and how protective orders, while important, are not always sufficient to prevent determined perpetrators from causing harm. During this preparation period, which lasted over a year, prosecutors methodically reviewed evidence, interviewed witnesses, and prepared their strategy for trial. They knew that the case would likely attract significant media attention and that the families of the victims would be closely watching to ensure that justice was served. The charges against Joseph Castorina were severe, 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. In Colorado, first-degree murder convictions carry mandatory life sentences, so the stakes could not have been higher. In May 2024, nearly 2 years after the murders, Joseph Castorina's trial finally began in Arapahoe County. The case had attracted significant media attention, both because of the horrific nature of the crimes and because it represented such a clear example of domestic violence taken to its most extreme conclusion. Judge David Carpel presided over the trial, which was expected to last approximately 9 days. The prosecution was led by Senior Chief Deputy District Attorney Darcy Kofall, who had extensive experience in handling serious violent crimes and domestic violence cases. During jury selection, potential jurors had to be screened carefully to ensure they could handle the disturbing evidence and testimony that would be presented. Cases involving multiple murders and domestic violence often require jurors who can remain objective despite the emotional nature of the evidence. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their case methodically, explaining the relationship between Joseph and his ex-girlfriend, the escalating pattern of abuse and control, and the tragic events of October 30, 2022. They painted a picture of a young man who could not accept rejection and who chose to destroy the lives of innocent people rather than accept that his relationship was over. The defense faced an extremely difficult task. With overwhelming evidence against their client, including witness testimony and physical evidence from the crime scene, they had limited options for mounting an effective defense. They might attempt to argue for lesser charges or focus on mitigation factors during sentencing, but the evidence of Joseph's guilt was substantial. The prosecution began presenting their case by establishing the timeline of events leading up to the murders. They showed how Joseph's behavior had escalated to the point where his ex-girlfriend and her family members felt the need to seek protective orders. They demonstrated that this was not a crime of passion or a momentary loss of control, but rather a calculated attack on people Joseph saw as obstacles to his desires. Witness testimony was particularly powerful in this case. The surviving victim was able to provide first-hand account of the shooting, describing the terror and chaos of that night. This testimony was crucial in establishing exactly what happened and demonstrating the deliberate nature of Joseph's actions. Expert witnesses testified about domestic violence patterns, explaining to the jury how abusers often escalate their behavior when victims try to leave. This context helped the jury understand that the murders were not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of an escalating pattern of abuse and control. The prosecution's case against Joseph Castorina was built on multiple types of evidence, each piece contributing to a comprehensive picture of what happened on the night of October 30, 2022. Physical evidence from the crime scene was extensive. Forensic investigators had processed the house on Galena Street thoroughly, collecting ballistics evidence, DNA samples, and other physical traces that could link Joseph to the murders. The murder weapon and its trajectory patterns helped establish how the shooting had occurred. The surviving victim's testimony was perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence presented during the trial. This individual had witnessed the shooting firsthand and could describe Joseph's actions, demeanor, and statements during the attack. Their testimony provided crucial details about the sequence of events and Joseph's apparent state of mind. Digital evidence also played a role in the case. Cell phone records, social media communications, and other electronic data helped establish Joseph's whereabouts before and after the murders, as well as his communications with his ex-girlfriend and potentially her family members. The protective orders filed just 6 days before the murders provided important context for understanding Joseph's motive. These documents demonstrated that his behavior had already escalated to the point where multiple family members felt threatened enough to seek legal protection. Law enforcement officers who responded to the scene testified about what they found when they arrived at the house. Their testimony helped establish the timeline of events and provided professional observations about the crime scene that supported the prosecution's theory of the case. Medical examiner testimony provided details about the victim's injuries and causes of death. While this testimony was undoubtedly difficult for the families to hear, it was necessary to establish the severity of Joseph's actions and to prove the murder charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Character witnesses for the victims helped humanize them for the jury, ensuring that they were remembered as real people with families, friends, dreams, and contributions to their community, rather than simply as statistics in a criminal case. Throughout the presentation of evidence, the prosecution worked to demonstrate that Joseph's actions were premeditated and deliberate, not the result of a momentary loss of control or mental health crisis. This distinction was crucial for securing first-degree murder convictions rather than lesser charges. After 9 days of trial and deliberation, the jury reached their verdict on May 16, 2024. Joseph Castorina was found guilty on all charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. The jury also found him guilty of sentence enhancement charges that would affect his final punishment. The verdict was a complete victory for the prosecution and represented a measure of justice for the victims' families. However, it was also just the first step in the final phase of the legal process, as sentencing proceedings would follow. In Colorado, first-degree murder convictions carry mandatory life sentences, so there was no question about the basic framework of Joseph's punishment. However, the judge still had to make decisions about whether the sentences would run concurrently or consecutively, and what additional penalties would be imposed for the other charges. The attempted murder conviction was significant because it recognized that Joseph had tried to kill the surviving victim as well, and that person had only survived through luck or chance. This conviction ensured that Joseph would face additional penalties for his attempt to kill a 5th person that night. Sentence enhancement charges can add additional time to a defendant's punishment based on specific circumstances of the crime. These might include factors such as the use of a weapon, the particularly heinous nature of the crime, or the vulnerability of the victims. During the sentencing phase, victim impact statements were presented to the court. Family members and friends of the deceased victims had the opportunity to describe how the murders had affected their lives and to speak directly to the court about the losses they had suffered. These impact statements served multiple purposes. They helped ensure that the victims were remembered as real people rather than simply as elements of a criminal case. They provided the families with an opportunity to have their voices heard in the legal process. And they helped the judge understand the full scope of the harm that Joseph's actions had caused. The surviving victim also had the opportunity to describe how the attack had affected their life. Living through such a traumatic experience and losing multiple family members in a single night undoubtedly created lasting psychological and emotional damage that would affect this person for the rest of their life. On September 3, 2024, Judge David Carpel sentenced Joseph Castorina to 4 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 24 years for the attempted murder conviction and sentence enhancements. The consecutive nature of the sentences was particularly significant. Rather than allowing the sentences to run concurrently, which would have meant Joseph served them simultaneously, the judge ordered that they run consecutively, meaning they would add up to ensure that Joseph would never be released from prison. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Carpel did not mince words in describing Joseph's actions and character. The judge characterized him as an insignificant little man with a big gun, and criticized his cowardly decision to ambush and murder innocent family members rather than accept that his relationship was over. The harsh language from the bench reflected the judge's assessment of both the severity of the crimes and Joseph's character. Judges typically maintain professional decorum even when dealing with serious criminals, so the particularly strong language suggested the depth of the court's condemnation for Joseph's actions. Senior Chief Deputy District Attorney Darcy Kofall noted that Mr. Castorina attempted to evade justice by fleeing to Mexico, highlighting not only the original crimes but also Joseph's efforts to avoid responsibility for his actions. The sentence ensured that Joseph Castorina would spend the rest of his life in prison, never again having the opportunity to harm innocent people. For the victims' families, this represented the maximum justice that the legal system could provide, though it could never truly compensate for their losses. The case also served as a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and the importance of taking threats seriously. The case highlighted the devastating consequences of failing to address escalating domestic violence and exposed the limitations of protective orders in preventing harm, particularly when abusers repeatedly violate court mandates. As we reach the end of this tragic story, it's important to reflect on the broader lessons that emerge from the Joseph Castorina case. This was not simply a story about one young man's descent into violence, but rather a case study in the deadly potential of domestic abuse when it goes unchecked. The murders on Galena Street represent one of the worst possible outcomes of domestic violence escalation. Despite the victims doing everything they were supposed to do, recognizing the danger, documenting it, seeking legal protection, they were unable to protect themselves from someone determined to cause harm. This case demonstrates the complex challenges facing domestic violence victims and their families. Leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time for victims, as abusers may escalate their tactics when they feel they're losing control. The protective orders in this case, filed just 6 days before the murders, show that the family was aware of the danger and taking appropriate steps to protect themselves. However, the case also shows the limitations of legal protections when dealing with determined perpetrators. Protective orders are important tools, but they cannot provide physical protection against someone who is willing to violate them and face the consequences. The international aspect of this case, Joseph's flight to Mexico and subsequent extradition, demonstrates the global reach of modern law enforcement cooperation. Despite crossing international borders, Joseph was ultimately brought to justice through the coordinated efforts of agencies in both countries. For the Aurora community, this case likely served as a wake-up call about domestic violence in their midst. For innocent people lost their lives because one young man could not accept that he did not have the right to control another person's choices and relationships. The families affected by this tragedy will carry the impact of these losses for the rest of their lives. No legal sentence can truly restore what they lost that October night, but the successful prosecution and harsh sentence at least ensured that justice was served and that Joseph Castorina will never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the lives of Jesus Serrano, Maria Anita Serrano, Kenneth Eugene Green Luque, and Rudolfo Salgado Perez. They were real people with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them. Their story serves as a reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing domestic violence before it escalates to tragedy, and of the need to support victims who are trying to escape dangerous relationships. This case stands as a testament to the dedicated work of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and advocates who work tirelessly to seek justice for victims of domestic violence. While the legal system could not prevent this tragedy, it did ensure that the perpetrator faced the full consequences of his actions. The Joseph Castorina case reminds us that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. May they rest in peace, and may their story serve as a warning about the deadly potential of unchecked domestic abuse. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet suburbs of Riverview, Florida, where palm trees sway gently in the humid evening breeze and ranch-style homes line peaceful residential streets, March 18, 2018 began like any other Sunday. Children played in their yards, families prepared for another week ahead, and the setting sun painted the sky in soft pastels over Tampa Bay. But as darkness fell over one particular home on Pike Lake Drive, a tragedy would unfold that would shock the community and leave investigators struggling to comprehend the depths of human cruelty. This is the story of Kenyatta Barron, known to her friends and family simply as Kiki, a 33-year-old mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her children. This is also the story of her 9-year-old daughter, Ronivia O'Neill, a special needs child who lived with autism and communicated through gestures and expressions rather than words. And it's the story of 8-year-old Ronnie 4, who would survive the unthinkable and become a key witness to one of Florida's most disturbing family violence cases. The perpetrator of these crimes was someone who should have been their protector, Ronnie O'Neill 3, a 29-year-old man who had shared a life with Kenyatta and was the father of both children. Kenyatta Barron was a dedicated mother who had built her life around her 2 children. Those who knew her described her as a woman of quiet strength, someone who faced the challenges of raising a special needs child with patience and unwavering love. Ronivia, despite being nonverbal due to her autism, was a bright and expressive child who communicated with her family in her own unique way. Her younger brother Ronnie was protective of his sister and shared the close bond that often develops between siblings when one needs extra care. Ronnie O'Neill 3, the children's father, had a complicated relationship with the family. While he and Kenyatta were no longer together romantically, they maintained contact due to their shared children. Those who knew the family would later tell investigators that the relationship had become increasingly strained, with Ronnie displaying erratic behavior and making statements that concerned those around him. In the months leading up to the tragedy, friends and neighbors noticed changes in Ronnie's demeanor. He had begun expressing unusual beliefs and paranoid thoughts about the government and authority figures. Some would later describe his behavior as increasingly volatile, though none could have predicted the horrific events that were to come. The evening began quietly enough. Kenyatta was at home with her children, going about their usual Sunday routine. The house on Pike Lake Drive was modest but comfortable, a single-story home where she had tried to create a safe and nurturing environment for Ronivia and young Ronnie. As darkness settled over Riverview, something triggered a violent rage in Ronnie O'Neill 3. What exactly precipitated his actions that night may never be fully understood, but the evidence would later paint a picture of calculated brutality that defied comprehension. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came in the form of a frantic 911 call. At approximately 11:43 p.m., emergency dispatchers received a call that would haunt them for years to come. It was Kenyatta's voice on the line, desperate and terrified, begging for help as chaos erupted around her. "Please help me," she could be heard saying, her voice strained with terror. In the background of that call, investigators would later detect the sounds of a struggle, voices raised in anger, and the unmistakable sounds of violence. The call lasted only seconds before the line went dead, but it was enough to set emergency services in motion. What happened next can only be pieced together through physical evidence, witness testimony, and the brave account of the sole survivor, 8-year-old Ronnie 4. According to the investigation that followed, Ronnie O'Neill 3 had armed himself with a shotgun and began his attack on the family. The assault began with Kenyatta. Forensic evidence would later show that she was shot once in the right shoulder with the shotgun. But when the weapon ran out of ammunition, the attack didn't stop, it escalated. In a rage that seemed to know no bounds, Ronnie continued to beat Kenyatta with the shotgun itself, using the heavy weapon as a club. The medical examiner would later determine that Kenyatta suffered multiple lacerations and severe blunt force trauma to her neck and head. The cause of death was ultimately ruled as blunt force trauma to the head. The brutality of the attack was such that even seasoned investigators struggled to process the crime scene. But Ronnie's violence didn't end with Kenyatta. He turned his attention to his own children, two innocent young lives who looked to him as their father and protector. 9-year-old Ronivia, who due to her autism was likely confused and terrified by the chaos erupting around her, became the next target. Unable to understand what was happening or to plead for her life in the way a typical child might, she was defenseless against the attack that followed. Ronnie O'Neill III took a hatchet, a tool that should have been used for yard work or splitting wood, and used it to attack his own daughter. The details of what happened to Ronivia are almost too horrific to recount, but court records show that she suffered fatal injuries from both the hatchet and severe beating. The 9-year-old child, who had never harmed anyone in her short life, died at the hands of the person who should have protected her above all others. 8-year-old Ronnie IV witnessed the murder of his mother and sister, but his ordeal was far from over. His father turned on him as well, stabbing the young boy multiple times. The injuries were severe, wounds that would have killed many adults, let alone a small child. But somehow, through a combination of pure will and perhaps divine intervention, young Ronnie survived. Even as his father continued his rampage, the boy found strength he didn't know he possessed. In what can only be described as a miracle, he managed to escape the house and make it outside to safety. The sight that greeted arriving deputies and paramedics was something none of them would ever forget. A severely injured 8-year-old child, covered in blood from multiple stab wounds, staggering toward them from a house that was now beginning to burn. As if the murders weren't horrific enough, Ronnie O'Neill III had one final act of destruction planned. After killing Kenyatta and Ronivia and attempting to kill his son, he set the house on fire, apparently hoping to destroy the evidence of his crimes and perhaps to kill his surviving son in the flames. The fire began to consume the home where this family had lived, where children had played and where a mother had tried her best to build a life for her kids. Neighbors began to notice the smoke and flames, and calls started flooding into emergency services. First responders arrived to find the house engulfed in flames and a critically injured child who had somehow escaped the inferno. The boy was immediately rushed to Tampa General Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. While emergency responders were focused on fighting the fire and saving young Ronnie's life, Ronnie O'Neill III had fled the scene. He didn't get far. Law enforcement officers, responding to the 911 calls and the fire, quickly flooded the area. When deputies attempted to apprehend him, Ronnie resisted arrest, adding another charge to what would become a lengthy list of criminal counts. His capture marked the end of one of the most violent domestic terrorism incidents in the Tampa Bay area's recent history. As he was taken into custody, neighbors emerged from their homes to witness the aftermath of the tragedy. The quiet suburban street had become a crime scene, with fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles creating a chaotic tableau against the night sky. In the days and weeks that followed, investigators began the painstaking process of piecing together exactly what had happened in that Riverview home. The physical evidence painted a clear picture of the violence that had occurred, but understanding the why proved more elusive. Detectives interviewed neighbors, family members, and friends, trying to understand what could have driven a father to commit such unspeakable acts against his own family. What they found was a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior, paranoid beliefs, and warning signs that, in hindsight, seemed to point toward a man who was losing his grip on reality. The investigation revealed that Ronnie had been struggling with what appeared to be mental health issues, though this would never excuse or explain the level of violence he inflicted on his family. He had expressed bizarre conspiracy theories about the government and made statements that suggested he was living in a state of paranoia and delusion. Meanwhile, young Ronnie IV was fighting for his life in the hospital. The stab wounds he had sustained were severe, and doctors weren't initially certain he would survive. But the boy showed the same strength that had allowed him to escape the burning house, gradually recovering from his physical injuries while beginning the much longer process of healing from psychological trauma. The murders sent shockwaves through the Riverview community and beyond. Neighbors struggled to understand how such violence could erupt in their peaceful suburban neighborhood. Many had known the family, had seen the children playing in their yard, and had watched Kenyatta's dedication to caring for her special needs daughter. Local schools where the children had been enrolled provided counseling services for students and staff who had known them. The community rallied around the surviving child, with local organizations stepping forward to provide support for his ongoing medical and psychological care. The case also highlighted the often hidden struggles faced by families dealing with domestic violence and mental health issues. Advocates used the tragedy to draw attention to the warning signs that might help prevent similar incidents in the future. Ronnie O'Neill III was initially charged with multiple serious felonies, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, arson, aggravated child abuse, and resisting arrest. The state attorney's office announced its intention to seek the death penalty, given the heinous nature of the crimes. However, the legal process was complicated by questions about Ronnie's mental competency. In October 2018, he was found not competent to stand trial and was sent for mental health treatment. This decision sparked debate about the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. For months, Ronnie underwent psychiatric evaluation and treatment at a state facility. The question of competency in death penalty cases is always complex, as the legal system requires that a defendant be able to understand the charges against them and assist in their own defense. Finally, in May 2019, mental health professionals determined that Ronnie was competent to stand trial. The Department of Children and Families sent a letter to the court confirming this assessment, and the wheels of justice began to turn once again. One of the most unusual aspects of this case was Ronnie O'Neill III's decision to represent himself at trial. Against the advice of legal experts and despite having experienced attorneys available to him, he chose to act as his own counsel in a death penalty case. This decision would lead to some of the most disturbing and surreal moments in Florida legal history. The trial, which began in earnest in June 2021, 3 years after the murders, would become a media sensation for all the wrong reasons. Prosecutors Ronald Gale and Scott Harmon presented a straightforward case built on physical evidence, witness testimony, and the harrowing account of young Ronnie IV, who was now 11 years old and had to relive the worst night of his life in front of a jury. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough. They presented evidence of the 911 call, showing the jury the desperation in Kenyatta's voice as she begged for help. They called forensic experts who testified about the wounds inflicted on the victims and the evidence of arson that had nearly destroyed the crime scene. Perhaps most compelling was the testimony of the surviving son. Now 11 years old, the boy had to face his father in court and describe the night his world fell apart. With remarkable composure for someone so young, he recounted the events of March 18, 2018, providing crucial eyewitness testimony to the crimes. In one of the most disturbing moments of an already horrific trial, Ronnie O'Neill III chose to cross-examine his own son, the child he had tried to kill. This unprecedented situation forced an 11-year-old boy to sit in a witness stand while his father, acting as his own attorney, questioned him about the night of the murders. The cross-examination was mercifully brief, but it included moments that shocked even veteran court observers. When Ronnie asked his son what happened that night, the boy's simple response was devastating: "You stabbed me." Court officials took extraordinary measures to protect the child during this testimony, but nothing could shield him entirely from the psychological impact of having to face his father in such circumstances. Throughout the trial, Ronnie O'Neill III maintained his innocence and promoted various conspiracy theories about the charges against him. He claimed that he was the victim of a government setup and that the evidence against him had been fabricated. His defense strategy, such as it was, relied heavily on paranoid delusions about law enforcement and the judicial system. He made rambling statements to the jury that often had to be cut short by the judge when they veered into incoherent territory. Legal experts watching the trial noted that his self-representation was effectively ensuring his own conviction. His bizarre behavior in court, including outbursts and inappropriate statements, only reinforced the prosecution's case about his guilt and his dangerousness. After hearing all the evidence and enduring the spectacle of Ronnie's self-representation, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before reaching their verdict. On June 21, 2021, they found Ronnie O'Neill guilty on all counts. The convictions included 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Kenyatta Barron and Ronivia O'Neill, attempted first-degree murder for the attack on his son, 2 counts of aggravated child abuse, 1 count of arson, and 1 count of resisting a law enforcement officer. As the verdict was read, Ronnie showed little emotion, sitting quietly as the jury foreman announced the guilty verdicts that would effectively end his life as a free man. With the guilt phase complete, the trial moved to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Ronnie should be sentenced to death or to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution argued that the heinous nature of the crimes, particularly the murder of a special needs child and the attempt to kill his own son, warranted the ultimate punishment. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the attacks and the extreme cruelty involved. The defense, still conducted by Ronnie himself, offered little in the way of mitigation. His rambling statements to the jury during the penalty phase were largely incoherent and did nothing to generate sympathy for his situation. However, the jury ultimately decided against the death penalty, instead recommending life in prison without the possibility of parole. While some might have expected a death sentence given the nature of the crimes, the jury's decision reflected the complex factors that go into such determinations. On July 23, 2021, Judge Michelle Sisko formally sentenced Ronnie O'Neill to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In her remarks during sentencing, Judge Sisko addressed the defendant directly, making it clear that she had been deeply affected by the evidence presented during the trial. "I will be haunted by what I saw," Judge Sisko said, referring to the crime scene photos and evidence that had been presented during the trial. Her words captured what many who had followed the case felt, that this was a crime that challenged one's faith in humanity. The judge noted that even as Ronnie faced his final judgment for the murders, he had shown no remorse, no sorrow, and no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. This lack of remorse, she indicated, made it clear that he remained a danger to society. The sentence meant that Ronnie O'Neill would spend the rest of his life in a Florida state prison, never again to be free. For many who had followed the case, it was a just outcome, even if it couldn't bring back Kenyatta and Ronivia or undo the trauma suffered by young Ronnie. Throughout this entire ordeal, perhaps no one showed more strength and resilience than young Ronnie IV. Despite suffering severe physical injuries and psychological trauma that would affect him for the rest of his life, he had found the courage to testify against his father and help ensure that justice was served. After the trial, it was revealed that Detective Mike Blair, who had responded to the scene that terrible night in March 2018, had developed a special bond with the boy during the investigation. Recognizing that the child needed stability and love to heal from his trauma, Detective Blair and his wife made the extraordinary decision to adopt him. The adoption was finalized, giving young Ronnie a new family and a chance for a fresh start. Detective Blair spoke about the boy's incredible resilience and his ability to find joy and hope despite everything he had endured. "I am safe, I am loved," became the young boy's motto, words that seemed to capture his determination to overcome the darkness of his past and build a brighter future. The Riverview murders represent one of the most tragic examples of domestic violence taken to its ultimate extreme. The case highlighted several important issues that continue to resonate today. First, it demonstrated the particular vulnerability of children with special needs in domestic violence situations. Ronivia's autism made her unable to understand or escape the danger she faced, making her death all the more tragic and senseless. Second, the case showed how mental health issues, while never excusing criminal behavior, can contribute to escalating violence within families. The warning signs that friends and family noticed in the months before the murders serve as a reminder that early intervention might sometimes prevent such tragedies. Finally, the extraordinary courage shown by the surviving son serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Despite witnessing unimaginable violence and suffering severe trauma, he found the strength to help bring his father to justice and to begin rebuilding his life with a new family who could provide the love and support he needed. The case also sparked discussions about the legal system's handling of defendants who choose to represent themselves in serious criminal cases, particularly when that self-representation involves cross-examining their own victims. Today, several years after the trial concluded, the impact of the Riverview murders continues to be felt. The case has been studied by law enforcement agencies, legal scholars, and mental health professionals as they try to understand how such tragedies can be prevented. Victim advocacy groups have used the case to highlight the importance of recognizing warning signs of domestic violence and the particular risks faced by children in such situations. The fact that the violence in this case was committed by a father against his own children underscores the reality that the home, which should be a place of safety, can sometimes become the most dangerous place of all. For the Riverview community, the memories of that March night in 2018 serve as a reminder of how quickly life can change and how precious the bonds between family members truly are. The house on Pike Lake Drive where the murders occurred has since been demolished, but the impact of what happened there continues to ripple through the lives of all who were touched by the tragedy. The story of Kenyatta Barron and Ronivia O'Neill is ultimately a story about love, loss, and the inexplicable nature of human evil. Kenyatta was a devoted mother who worked hard to provide for her children and give them the best life possible. Ronivia was an innocent child whose disability made her even more vulnerable and precious to those who loved her. Their deaths represent not just the loss of two individuals, but the destruction of a family and the shattering of a community's sense of security. Yet from this darkness has emerged a story of survival and hope, embodied by young Ronnie's journey from victim to survivor to beloved son in a new family. The case serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence knows no boundaries and that the most dangerous person in someone's life is often someone they trust and love. It also demonstrates that even in the face of the most horrific circumstances, the human capacity for resilience, love, and healing can ultimately triumph. As we remember Kenyatta and Ronivia, we're reminded of the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves and of the responsibility we all share to watch for warning signs that might prevent such tragedies in the future. Their story, while heartbreaking, continues to serve as a call to action for all of us to be more vigilant, more compassionate, and more committed to creating a world where all families can be truly safe. In the quiet suburbs of Riverview, where life has gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm, the memory of that terrible March night serves as both a wound that may never fully heal and a reminder that even in our darkest moments, the human spirit's capacity for survival and renewal can shine through. The story of the Riverview murders is now part of the historical record, a case study in the extremes of human behavior that law enforcement officials, legal professionals, and mental health experts will examine for years to come. But beyond the legal proceedings and the academic analysis, it remains, at its heart, the story of a mother's love, a child's innocence, and another child's remarkable survival against impossible odds. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, where communities are separated by hundreds of miles of untamed landscape and the harsh beauty of nature can both inspire and intimidate, stories of missing persons take on a particularly haunting quality. The sheer enormity of the last frontier means that when someone vanishes, they can truly disappear into a void that seems almost infinite. This is the story of Shirley Skeek, a young Alaska Native woman whose disappearance in early 2019 would lead to a tragic discovery nearly a year later, highlighting not just the vulnerability of those living on society's margins, but also the enduring love of family who refuse to give up hope. Shirley Skeek was born in the small southeast Alaska community of Kake, a place where everyone knows everyone, and families have deep roots that stretch back generations. Nestled on the northwest shore of Kupreanof Island, Kake is home to fewer than 600 people, most of whom are members of the Tlingit tribe. It's the kind of place where the rhythms of traditional Alaska Native life still pulse beneath the surface of modern existence, where the ocean provides sustenance and the forest provides shelter, and where community bonds run as deep as the surrounding fjords. As the youngest of 6 children, Shirley grew up surrounded by siblings who would later describe her as the heart of their family. Those who knew her painted a picture of a woman who was kind, intelligent, and naturally outgoing. She had the sort of warm personality that drew people to her, the kind of person who could light up a room simply by walking into it. Her family remembers her laugh, the way she could find humor even in difficult situations, and her unwavering loyalty to those she loved. But life in rural Alaska, particularly for Alaska Native communities, comes with unique challenges. Economic opportunities can be scarce, and the isolation that makes these places beautiful can also make them difficult places to build a life. Like many young people from small Alaska communities, Shirley eventually made her way to larger population centers, seeking opportunities and experiences that weren't available in her hometown. Her journey eventually led her to Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, home to nearly half the state's population. For someone from a community of 600, the transition to a city of 300,000 must have been jarring. Anchorage, while still maintaining that distinctly Alaskan character, is nonetheless a modern city with all the complexities and challenges that urban life brings. It's a place where someone can find opportunity, but also where someone can easily become lost in the crowd. By late 2018 and early 2019, those closest to Shirley would later describe her as being in what they termed a vulnerable state. While the specific details of her circumstances were kept private out of respect for her memory and her family's privacy, this phrase suggests someone who was struggling with challenges that made her particularly susceptible to harm. In Alaska, as in many places, certain populations face higher risks of violence and exploitation. Alaska Native women, in particular, experience rates of violence that are significantly higher than the national average. The isolation of many Alaska communities, combined with various social and economic factors, creates an environment where vulnerable individuals can become targets for those with malicious intent. Shirley was living in Anchorage during this period, trying to navigate whatever challenges she was facing. She was 28 years old, an age when many people are establishing their careers and building the foundations for their future lives. But for Shirley, this was a time marked by uncertainty and vulnerability. Her family, hundreds of miles away in southeast Alaska, could only watch from a distance and offer what support they could across the vast expanse of the Alaska wilderness. The nature of her vulnerability isn't something we need to dwell on in detail, but it's important to understand that Shirley was someone who, like many people facing difficult circumstances, may have found herself in situations or around people that posed risks to her safety. What's crucial to remember is that being in a vulnerable state doesn't make someone responsible for what happens to them. Shirley was a human being deserving of safety, respect, and protection, regardless of her circumstances. Communication in Alaska's remote communities often follows different patterns than it does in more connected places. People might go days or even weeks without regular contact, especially during winter months when weather can make travel and communication difficult. So when Shirley's family didn't hear from her for a while, it might not have immediately raised alarm bells. But as days turned into weeks, and the silence stretched on, her family's concern began to grow. Shirley, despite whatever challenges she was facing, maintained regular contact with her loved ones. She was the kind of person who checked in, who let people know she was okay. When that communication stopped, her family knew something was wrong. The decision to report someone missing is never easy. There's always that hope that they'll walk through the door or call at any moment with a perfectly reasonable explanation for their absence. There's the fear that involving authorities might create complications, especially in communities where relationships with law enforcement can be complicated. But by early January 2019, Shirley's family had reached the point where their concern outweighed their hesitation. On January 2, 2019, 2 weeks after they had last heard from Shirley, her family contacted authorities to report her missing. This wasn't a decision made lightly. It was the acknowledgement that something was seriously wrong, that their beloved daughter, sister, and family member was in danger and needed help. The initial missing person report would have triggered standard protocols. In Alaska, where missing persons cases are unfortunately not uncommon, law enforcement agencies have developed systems for handling these situations. Shirley's information would have been entered into databases, her photograph and description would have been circulated, and the initial investigation would have begun. Missing person investigations in Alaska face unique challenges. The state covers more than 665,000 square miles, much of it wilderness with no roads, no cell phone coverage, and no permanent human presence. Someone can disappear into this vastness and remain hidden for years, if they're ever found at all. Search and rescue operations, when they're possible, cover enormous areas with challenging terrain and often harsh weather conditions. For Shirley's case, investigators would have started with the basics. When was she last seen? Who were her known associates? What were her usual patterns and routines? In a city like Anchorage, this type of investigation involves canvassing neighborhoods, checking with local businesses, reviewing any available surveillance footage, and interviewing anyone who might have had recent contact with the missing person. Her family, meanwhile, took on their own search efforts. In the age of social media, missing person cases often generate their own grassroots networks of concerned individuals sharing information and keeping cases in the public eye. Missing posters with Shirley's photograph began appearing online and around Anchorage. Her family used every resource available to them, reaching out through traditional media, social networks, and community organizations. The posters showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, someone who looked like she could be anyone's daughter or sister. They included the basic information: her name, age, physical description, and the date she was last seen. But behind those simple facts was a family's desperate hope that someone, somewhere, had seen Shirley and could provide a clue about what had happened to her. As winter turned to spring in Alaska, and spring turned to summer, the investigation continued but with little progress. Missing person cases can be among the most frustrating for both investigators and families. Without a body, a crime scene, or witnesses, there's often little concrete evidence to work with. The investigation becomes a matter of following up on tips, checking and rechecking information, and hoping that something will break the case open. On May 27, 2019, nearly 5 months after Shirley was reported missing, someone made a discovery that would change everything. Along the Seward Highway, south of Anchorage, human remains were found. The Seward Highway is one of Alaska's most scenic routes, winding through the Chugach Mountains and along Tinigan Arm as it connects Anchorage to the Kenai Peninsula. It's a route traveled by thousands of tourists every year, drawn by the spectacular mountain and ocean views. But on this spring day, the highway would become part of a much darker story. The remains were found in an area that, while accessible from the highway, was remote enough that they had gone undetected for months. In Alaska's wilderness, human remains can be scattered by animals, buried by snow, or simply hidden by the dense vegetation that flourishes during the brief but intense growing season. The discovery triggered a complex process of investigation and identification. When human remains are found under suspicious circumstances, a careful protocol must be followed to preserve any potential evidence while also working to identify the victim. The remains were carefully collected and transported to the Alaska State Medical Examiner's office, where the long process of identification and determination of cause of death would begin. For months, the remains would remain unidentified. This isn't uncommon in cases where decomposition or other factors have made visual identification impossible. Identifying human remains often requires dental records, DNA analysis, or other forensic techniques that can take considerable time, especially in a state like Alaska where resources may be limited and cases may need to be sent to laboratories outside the state. During this period, Shirley's family continued to live in the terrible limbo of not knowing what had happened to their loved one. Were the remains that had been found those of their daughter and sister? Were they still out there somewhere, perhaps alive but unable to contact them? The uncertainty was likely more painful than even the worst news would have been. It wasn't until late December 2019, more than 7 months after the remains were discovered, that dental records confirmed what Shirley's family probably feared but hoped against. The remains found along the Seward Highway were those of 28-year-old Shirley Skeek. The identification brought an end to the uncertainty, but it also brought the devastating confirmation that Shirley was gone. The location where Shirley's remains were found raises difficult questions about what happened to her. The area along the Seward Highway, while scenic, is also isolated. It's the kind of place where someone could dispose of a body with little risk of immediate discovery. The fact that the remains went undetected for months suggests that whoever was responsible for Shirley's death had some knowledge of the area and had chosen the location deliberately. For investigators, the identification of Shirley's remains marked the beginning of a new phase of the investigation. What had been a missing person case was now officially a death investigation. The focus shifted from finding Shirley to understanding how she had died and who was responsible. The autopsy process would be crucial to this new phase of the investigation. Alaska's State Medical Examiner's Office would need to determine not just that the remains were Shirley's, but also how she had died. Had she died of natural causes? Was it an accident? Or was it something more sinister? The condition of the remains, having been exposed to Alaska's harsh weather conditions for months, would make this determination challenging. The autopsy results, when they finally came, brought both answers and new questions. The Alaska State Medical Examiner's Office determined that Shirley's death was a homicide. This ruling meant that someone had intentionally killed her, transforming the case from a missing person investigation into a murder investigation. The determination that Shirley's death was a homicide was based on evidence that the medical examiner found during the autopsy. While the specific details of that evidence weren't made public, the ruling meant that investigators could definitively say that Shirley hadn't died of natural causes or accident. Someone had taken her life. With the homicide ruling, the case was officially transferred to the Alaska Bureau of Investigation, the state's major crimes unit. The ABI handles the most serious criminal cases in Alaska, particularly those that occur outside of Anchorage and Fairbanks, which have their own major crimes units. The involvement of the ABI signaled that this was now being treated as a priority case deserving of the state's most experienced investigators. The announcement of the homicide ruling was made public on December 30, 2019, almost exactly a year after Shirley had last been in contact with her family. For her loved ones, the ruling brought a mixture of emotions. On one hand, there was relief in finally knowing what had happened to Shirley. The terrible uncertainty was over. On the other hand, there was the devastating confirmation that someone had intentionally taken the life of someone they loved. The news of Shirley's murder was particularly cruel for a family that had already endured more than their share of tragedy. In a heartbreaking article published in the Juneau Empire, reporter Ben Hohenstadt revealed that Shirley's death was just the latest in what he described as a string of tragedies for the Skeek family. While respecting the family's privacy, it's clear that losing Shirley was not the first devastating loss they had experienced. In small, tight-knit communities like Cake, families often face a disproportionate burden of tragedy, whether from accidents in Alaska's dangerous working conditions, health issues related to limited access to medical care, or violence that affects Alaska Native communities at higher rates than the general population. The fact that this family had already endured multiple losses makes Shirley's murder even more heartbreaking. These were people who had already experienced the pain of losing loved ones, who had already navigated the complex emotions of grief and loss, and who were now being asked to endure yet another devastating blow. It also speaks to the resilience of Alaska Native communities and families. Despite repeated tragedies, despite systemic challenges and historical trauma, families like the Skeeks continue to support each other, to seek justice for their lost loved ones, and to maintain their cultural connections and community bonds. Their strength in the face of such pain is both inspiring and deeply moving. Following the homicide ruling, the Alaska Bureau of Investigation launched what would become an ongoing investigation into Shirley's murder. In their public statements, investigators made it clear that they were treating this as an active case and were seeking information from anyone who might have known Shirley or had information about her disappearance or death. The investigation would have involved retracing Shirley's last known activities, interviewing people who knew her, and examining any physical evidence that might have been recovered with her remains. In homicide cases, even small pieces of information can be crucial to solving the crime. A casual conversation overheard by a friend, a sighting by a stranger, or a piece of physical evidence overlooked during the initial search could all potentially break the case open. Investigators also reached out to the public for help. They established tip lines and encouraged anyone with information about Shirley, her disappearance, or her death to contact authorities. In cases like this, where the victim may have been living a somewhat transient lifestyle or associating with people on the margins of society, public tips can be particularly valuable. The fact that Shirley's remains were found along the Seward Highway, rather than in Anchorage where she was living, suggests that whoever was responsible had transportation and knowledge of the area. This could mean that the perpetrator was familiar with the region, had planned the disposal of the body in advance, or had some other connection to the Kenai Peninsula area. Shirley Skeek's murder, while tragic in its own right, also fits into a broader pattern of violence against Alaska Native women that has been recognized as a crisis requiring urgent attention. According to various studies and reports, Alaska Native women experience rates of violence that are among the highest in the nation. This violence often goes unreported, uninvestigated, or unresolved. There are many factors that contribute to this crisis. Historical trauma from colonization and forced assimilation has disrupted traditional social structures and created intergenerational effects that continue to impact communities today. Economic challenges in rural communities can lead to social problems including substance abuse and domestic violence. The isolation of many Alaska communities can make it difficult for victims to seek help or for law enforcement to respond effectively. Additionally, jurisdictional complexities can complicate investigations, particularly when crimes involve tribal lands, state lands, and federal lands, each with their own law enforcement agencies and legal frameworks. These complications can create gaps in services and accountability that allow perpetrators to escape justice. Shirley's case represents not just an individual tragedy, but also a systemic failure to protect one of Alaska's most vulnerable populations. Her death is a reminder that behind statistics about violence against Alaska Native women are real people with families, dreams, and potential that was cut short by violence. As of the last public updates available, Shirley Skeek's murder remains an open investigation. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation continues to work the case, following up on leads and seeking new information that might help them identify and apprehend the person or persons responsible for her death. For investigators working cold cases or challenging homicide investigations, persistence is often the key to eventual resolution. Evidence that didn't seem significant at the time can take on new meaning with fresh eyes or new technology. Witnesses who were reluctant to speak initially may become more willing to cooperate as time passes. New forensic techniques may allow investigators to extract information from evidence that was previously not useful. The passage of time can work both for and against investigators. While memories may fade and witnesses may become harder to locate, time can also loosen tongues as relationships change and people become more willing to share information they once kept secret. In cases involving violence in Alaska's often small communities, this can be particularly important as social dynamics shift and evolve. Modern investigative techniques, including advanced DNA analysis, digital forensics, and geographic information systems, continue to evolve and improve. Evidence that couldn't be analyzed when Shirley's case was first investigated may now yield important clues. The integration of new technologies with traditional investigative techniques gives current investigators tools that weren't available to earlier generations of law enforcement. Beyond the tragedy of her death and the ongoing investigation into her murder, it's important to remember Shirley Skeek as a person who lived, who was loved, and who had value that extended far beyond the circumstances of her death. Her family's descriptions of her paint a picture of someone who brought joy and warmth to those around her, someone who was intelligent and outgoing, someone who had the capacity to make others feel better simply by being present. In the small community of Cake where Shirley was born, her memory is carried by those who knew her as a child, as a young woman finding her way in the world, and as a beloved family member. Her loss represents not just personal grief for her family, but also a loss for the community that raised her and the broader Alaska Native community of which she was a part. The fact that she was described as being in a vulnerable state at the time of her disappearance doesn't define who she was as a person. Many people face difficult periods in their lives, periods when they may be struggling with challenges that make them more susceptible to harm. This vulnerability doesn't diminish their worth as human beings or their right to safety and justice. Shirley's story is also a reminder of the strength and resilience of families who refuse to give up when a loved one goes missing. Her family's persistent efforts to find answers, their cooperation with law enforcement, and their willingness to keep her memory alive in the public consciousness are testaments to the enduring power of love and the human drive for justice. The investigation into Shirley Skeek's murder continues, and with it, the hope that someday her family will have the answers they deserve and that justice will be served. Cold cases are never truly closed until they're solved, and investigators continue to work these cases even when they're not actively in the public eye. For law enforcement agencies in Alaska, cases like Shirley's represent both a challenge and a commitment. The challenge lies in the complexity of investigating crimes in a state where vast distances, harsh weather, and limited resources can complicate even routine police work. The commitment is to the principle that every victim deserves justice, regardless of their circumstances or background. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation has made it clear that they continue to actively investigate Shirley's case and encourage anyone with information to come forward. Even seemingly insignificant details could prove important to the investigation. A conversation overheard years ago, a sighting that seemed unimportant at the time, or knowledge about relationships and activities that occurred around the time of Shirley's disappearance could all potentially provide crucial leads. Public involvement in these cases is often essential to their resolution. Many cold cases are solved not through dramatic breakthroughs by investigators, but through information provided by members of the public who decide to come forward with what they know. Sometimes this happens because relationships change and people become more willing to talk. Sometimes it happens because the burden of keeping secrets becomes too heavy to bear. The impact of Shirley's murder extends far beyond her immediate family and friends. In small communities like Cake, the loss of any community member creates ripples that affect everyone. When that loss is the result of violence, particularly violence that remains unresolved, those ripples can become waves that continue to affect the community for years. For other young Alaska Native women, Shirley's story serves as both a warning and a reminder of their own vulnerability. The statistics about violence against Alaska Native women are not abstract numbers, they represent real people like Shirley who had families, dreams, and futures that were cut short. This reality shapes how women in these communities move through the world, affecting their decisions about where they go, whom they trust, and how they navigate potentially dangerous situations. For advocates working to address violence against Alaska Native women, Shirley's case represents both the urgent need for their work and the consequences of societal failure to adequately protect vulnerable populations. These advocates work on multiple fronts, supporting survivors, educating communities about violence prevention, working with law enforcement to improve responses to violence, and advocating for policy changes that address the root causes of violence. The ongoing nature of Shirley's case also highlights the need for sustained resources and commitment to investigating crimes against Alaska Native people. Too often, cases involving Alaska Native victims receive less attention or fewer resources than similar cases involving non-Native victims. Ensuring that Shirley's case receives the attention and resources it deserves is part of a broader effort to ensure equal justice for all victims. Despite the challenges inherent in investigating a case like Shirley's murder, there are reasons to remain hopeful that it will eventually be resolved. Advances in forensic science continue to provide new tools for investigators, and the growing awareness of violence against Alaska Native women has led to increased resources and attention for these cases. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation has shown a commitment to investigating this case thoroughly and completely. Their ongoing requests for public assistance and their continued work on the case suggest that they have not given up hope of finding answers. Modern investigative techniques, combined with persistent detective work, have solved cases that remained cold for decades. There's also hope that increased public awareness of cases like Shirley's will lead to broader social changes that help prevent similar tragedies in the future. Advocacy groups, community organizations, and government agencies are working to address the underlying issues that contribute to violence against Alaska Native women. While these efforts may not bring Shirley back, they could help prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. The power of community support and public attention should also not be underestimated. When cases remain in the public consciousness, when people continue to share information and ask questions, it increases the pressure on perpetrators and may eventually lead to someone coming forward with crucial information. As we reach the end of Shirley Skeek's story, it's important to remember that while her life was cut short by violence, the story of who she was and what she meant to those who loved her continues. Her family's love for her, their determination to find answers, and their commitment to keeping her memory alive ensure that Shirley's legacy is not defined solely by how she died, but also by how she lived and how she was loved. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, where the aurora borealis dances across winter skies and the summer sun barely sets, the search for justice for Shirley Skeek continues. Her case remains open, and investigators continue to work toward the day when they can provide her family with the answers they deserve and the justice that Shirley herself deserves. For those listening to this story, perhaps as they drift off to sleep, Shirley's case serves as a reminder of the preciousness and fragility of life. It's a reminder that behind every missing person report and every homicide investigation is a real person who was loved and is missed. It's a reminder that justice may be slow, but it should never be abandoned. If you have any information about Shirley Skeek's disappearance or death, investigators encourage you to contact the Alaska State Troopers. Even information that might seem insignificant could prove crucial to solving this case and bringing justice for Shirley and peace for her family. In the darkness of an Alaska night, under the same stars that Shirley once looked upon, her family continues to seek answers, investigators continue to search for truth, and Shirley's memory continues to live on in the hearts of those who loved her. Her story is not over yet. Rest in peace, Shirley Skeek. You were loved. You are missed. You are not forgotten. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.